There is a city burning tonight. You can see it from miles away. A glow against the darkness where no glow should be. The flames climb higher than the walls that once seemed eternal, higher than the towers that generations of kings had built stone upon stone, upon stone. The smoke rises in great columns, black against the stars, carrying with it the ashes of palaces and temples, of homes where children slept, of streets where merchants called their wares just yesterday morning. This is Troy. And this is the last night it will ever know. 10 years of war have led to this moment. 10 years of blood and bronze, of heroes rising and falling like waves against a shore. The greatest warriors of an age have fought beneath these walls. Gods themselves have taken sides, hurling their divine power into the chaos of mortal combat. And now, finally, impossibly, the city that withstood 1,000 ships and 10,000 spears is dying. But to understand this ending, you must first understand its beginning. And the beginning is not what you might expect. It does not start with armies or with anger. It does not start with the face of a beautiful woman or the ambition of a prince. No, this story begins somewhere far gentler, far more innocent. It begins with a wedding. It begins with a gift. It begins with a single golden apple, and the 3 words inscribed upon its surface that would set the world ablaze. So, let your eyes grow heavy now. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Wherever you are in this world tonight, whatever time the clock shows in your corner of existence, know that you are safe here. You are held in the embrace of a story older than memory, a tale that humanity has whispered to itself for 3,000 years. And like all the great stories, this one knows how to carry you gently, how to lead you through wonder and tragedy and beauty until sleep finds you somewhere along the way. This is the complete story of the Trojan War. Every hero, every battle, every heartbreak, from the golden apple to the wooden horse, from the first spark of divine jealousy to the final flames that consumed an empire. Let us go back now, back before the burning, back before the blood, back to a time when the world was young and even the gods believed in happy endings. Let us begin with a wedding. The waters of Thessaly lay perfectly still on the morning the gods descended to celebrate a marriage that would change the course of history. Not a ripple disturbed the surface of the sea. Not a breath of wind stirred the olive groves that lined the coastal hills. It was as if nature itself held its breath, sensing that something momentous was about to unfold, something that would echo through the centuries in ways that no one present could possibly imagine. The wedding of Peleus and Thetis was to be the most magnificent celebration the world had ever witnessed. Peleus was a mortal king, ruler of the Myrmidons, a man renowned throughout Greece for his honor and his courage. He had sailed with the Argonauts in search of the Golden Fleece. He had stood beside Heracles in battle. His name was spoken with respect in every corner of the civilized world. But it was not Peleus who made this wedding extraordinary. It was his bride. Thetis was a goddess, a Nereid, daughter of the ancient sea god Nereus. She moved through the waters of the Mediterranean with a grace that made dolphins seem clumsy by comparison. Her hair flowed like currents of liquid silver. Her eyes held the deep blue mystery of ocean trenches where no light had ever reached. When she laughed, the sound was like waves breaking gently on a moonlit shore. The gods of Olympus had long admired Thetis. Zeus himself, the king of heaven, had desired her once. So had his brother Poseidon, lord of the seas. But a prophecy had given them pause. A prediction whispered by the ancient Titaness Themis that chilled even the hearts of immortals. The son of Thetis, Themis declared, would grow to become greater than his father, more powerful, more glorious, a force that would reshape the very order of existence. For gods who had overthrown their own parents to claim power, this prophecy carried a weight that mortals could barely comprehend. Zeus remembered all too well how he had risen against his father Cronos, how the Titans had been cast down into the lightless depths of Tartarus. The thought that his own son might do the same to him, that a child born of Thetis might one day hurl thunderbolts at the throne of Olympus, was enough to make even the king of gods reconsider his desires. And so, with a wisdom born of self-preservation, the Olympians decided that Thetis must marry a mortal. Her divine beauty, her oceanic grace, her power over the waters of the world, all of this would be bound to a human husband whose mortality would ensure that any son she bore would be limited, controllable, safely less than divine. Peleus was chosen. Whether he was selected by the gods or won his bride through his own heroic efforts, the ancient sources disagree. Some say Zeus appointed him directly, recognizing in the mortal king a worthy vessel for divine favor. Others tell of how Peleus tracked Thetis to her secret grotto, how he wrestled with her as she transformed from woman to fire to serpent to raging tiger, how he held on through every transformation until she finally yielded and agreed to be his wife. However it happened, the wedding was arranged, and on that windless morning in Thessaly, the guests began to arrive. They came from Olympus first, descending through clouds that parted like curtains before their radiance. Zeus arrived in all his terrible majesty, lightning flickering at the edges of his robes, his presence filling the air with the smell of ozone and the crackle of barely contained power. Beside him walked Hera, his queen, her beauty cold and perfect as a statue carved from moonlight, her eyes seeing everything and approving of very little. Poseidon rose from the sea itself, his chariot pulled by horses whose manes were foam and whose hooves struck sparks from the surface of the water. He brought gifts from the depths, pearls the size of fists, coral formations of impossible delicacy, shells that whispered secrets when held to the ear. Apollo came with his lyre, ready to provide music that would make the spheres themselves weep with joy. His twin sister Artemis walked beside him, her hunting dogs padding silently at her heels, her silver bow gleaming in the early light. Athena arrived in full armor, though her spear was wreathed in olive branches for the occasion. Aphrodite floated rather than walked, surrounded by an aura of such overwhelming beauty that flowers bloomed where her shadow fell. Hermes darted everywhere, carrying messages, adjusting arrangements, ensuring that every detail was perfect. Hephaestus had crafted the thrones where the divine guests would sit, each one a masterwork of gold and silver and precious gems. Demeter had blessed the earth around the wedding site, causing fruit trees to burst into simultaneous bloom and ripening, their branches heavy with offerings for the feast. Even Hades, lord of the underworld, emerged from his dark kingdom to attend. He rarely left the realm of the dead, but this wedding was too significant to miss. He stood apart from the other gods, his robes the color of shadows, his presence a reminder that all things, even joy, even love, eventually made their way to his domain. The mortal guests were no less impressive, though they seemed to shine with a different quality of light beside the radiance of the gods. The greatest heroes of the age had come to honor Peleus, men whose names would be remembered long after their bones had turned to dust. They had sailed together, fought together, bled together. Now they gathered in peace, their weapons set aside, their rivalries forgotten in the spirit of celebration. The ceremony itself took place as the sun reached its zenith, flooding the world with golden light. Vows were exchanged in the old way, words binding mortal to immortal in a union that defied the natural order of things. Thetis wore a gown woven from sea foam and starlight, so delicate that it seemed to dissolve and reform with every movement she made. Peleus stood beside her in armor polished to a mirror shine, looking both proud and slightly terrified, as any mortal man might when marrying a goddess. The feast that followed was beyond description, though generations of poets would try. Ambrosia and nectar flowed freely, the food of the gods offered to mortal throats that would never taste anything so sublime again. The mortal foods were equally magnificent. Roasted meats and fresh breads, honeyed wines and fruits so perfect they seemed to glow from within. Apollo played his lyre, and the music wrapped around the guests like a warm embrace, filling every heart with a joy so pure it bordered on pain. Dancing followed, gods and mortals together, moving in patterns that had been old when the stars were young. Laughter echoed across the water. Toasts were raised to the happy couple, to their future children, to love and beauty and all good things. And through it all, unnoticed by the celebrating crowds, a shadow watched from the edges of the gathering. Her name was Eris, goddess of discord, of strife, of the chaos that lurks beneath every peaceful surface. She was sister to Ares, the god of war, and like her brother, she found sustenance in conflict. Where others saw harmony, she saw fragility. Where others heard laughter, she heard the silence that would follow when the laughter stopped. Eris had not been invited to the wedding. The omission was deliberate. Everyone knew that Eris brought trouble wherever she went, that her very presence could turn friends into enemies, lovers into strangers, peace into war. The gods had decided, with rare unanimous agreement, that this celebration was too important to risk. Let Eris stay away. Let one day at least pass without her poison. But Eris had learned of the wedding. Eris always learned of the things she was excluded from. And as she watched from the shadows, as she saw the joy and the beauty and the hope that filled every face, something twisted inside her. Something dark and hot and patient. If they wanted discord, she would give them discord. If they thought they could celebrate without her, could forget her, could pretend she did not exist, she would remind them. She would remind them all. She had brought a gift. From the folds of her dark robes, Eris withdrew an apple. But this was no ordinary fruit. It was made of solid gold, its surface gleaming with a light that seemed to come from within. It was beautiful. It was terrible. And on its surface, inscribed in letters that seemed to shift and writhe like living things, were 3 simple words. For the fairest. Eris smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. She waited until the celebration reached its peak, until the music was loudest and the joy most complete. Then, with a flick of her wrist, she threw the apple into the midst of the divine guests. It landed at the feet of the goddesses, rolling to a stop with a soft, golden chime. The music faltered. The dancing stopped. Every eye turned to the gleaming fruit and the words that proclaimed its purpose. For the fairest. 3 goddesses reached for it simultaneously. Hera, queen of Olympus, whose beauty was the standard against which all beauty was measured. Athena, goddess of wisdom, whose face was as perfect as the strategies she devised. Aphrodite, goddess of love itself, who had been born from sea foam and desire and whose mere presence could make mortals forget their own names. Each of them believed the apple was rightfully hers. Each of them was prepared to argue, to fight, to tear Olympus itself apart to claim what she deserved. The wedding celebration, so perfect just moments before, dissolved into chaos. Voices were raised. Accusations flew. The other gods stepped back, recognizing the danger, understanding that this was a conflict no one could safely resolve. From the shadows, Eris watched and smiled. Her work was done. The apple had been planted. Now she needed only to wait for it to bear its bitter fruit. The argument among the goddesses raged for hours, then days, then longer. No resolution could be found. Each goddess was convinced of her own superiority. Each was unwilling to yield even a fraction of the honor that the golden apple represented. Finally, inevitably, they brought the matter to Zeus. The king of gods listened to their arguments with a growing sense of dread. He knew this was a conflict without a good solution, a trap that Eris had laid with perfect malicious precision. If he chose Hera, his wife would be pleased, but Athena and Aphrodite would become his enemies. If he chose Athena, his favorite daughter would be honored, but the others would rage against him. If he chose Aphrodite, the goddess of love might bless his endeavors, but the combined wrath of Hera and Athena would make his existence unbearable. There was no safe choice. So Zeus, with the cunning that had made him king of gods, decided not to choose at all. He would delegate the decision. He would find a judge whose verdict he could not be blamed for, a mortal far enough removed from Olympus that the goddesses could not accuse Zeus of influencing the outcome. There was a young man, Zeus declared, a prince of Troy, living as a shepherd on the slopes of Mount Ida. His name was Paris, and he was known throughout the region for his fairness, his wisdom, his ability to settle disputes with justice and impartiality. Let Paris decide which goddess was the fairest. Let a mortal bear the weight of this impossible choice. The goddesses agreed, each confident that she would win. And so, without knowing it, a young shepherd tending his flocks on a quiet mountainside became the most important person in the world. The golden apple had found its true target. Mount Ida rises from the Trojan plain like a dream of what mountains should be. Its lower slopes are gentle, covered with meadows where wildflowers bloom in carpets of purple and gold. Higher up, forests of pine and oak whisper secrets to the wind, their branches home to birds whose songs echo through the valleys below. Higher still, bare rock reaches toward the sky, snow-capped even in summer, a throne for clouds to rest upon. It was here, on the middle slopes where the meadows met the forest, that Paris spent his days. He had not always been a shepherd. He had been born a prince, son of King Priam and Queen Hecuba of Troy. But before his birth, his mother had dreamed a terrible dream. She saw herself giving birth not to a child but to a flaming torch, and the torch set fire to all of Troy, burning the city to ashes while its people screamed. The seers interpreted the dream with unanimous dread. The child Hecuba carried would bring destruction to Troy. He must be killed immediately after birth, before he could grow to fulfill the prophecy. When Paris was born, Priam could not bring himself to murder his own son. Instead, he ordered a servant to take the infant to Mount Ida and leave him there to die of exposure. The servant obeyed, carrying the crying baby up the mountain paths until he found a suitably remote ledge. He placed the child there, turned away, and tried not to listen to the wails that followed him down the slope. But Paris did not die. A she-bear found him, drawn by his cries, and instead of killing him, she nursed him. When shepherds discovered this miracle, a baby being suckled by a wild bear, they took it as a sign from the gods. They adopted the child, raised him as one of their own, never knowing that the boy who helped them tend their flocks was actually heir to the throne of the mightiest city in Asia. Paris grew into a young man of extraordinary beauty. His hair was dark as a raven's wing, curling softly around a face that seemed carved by a sculptor who had set out to capture the essence of masculine grace. His eyes were the color of honey held up to sunlight, warm and intelligent and somehow sad, as if they saw things that others could not. His body was lean and strong from years of climbing mountain paths and wrestling wayward sheep, every movement unconsciously elegant. The local nymphs noticed him, of course. They watched from behind trees and rocks, giggling at his beauty, daring each other to approach him. One of them, Inoni, did more than watch. She fell in love with him and he with her. They married in the simple way of mountain folk, exchanging vows beside a stream while the sun set behind the peaks. For a time, Paris was happy. He had his sheep, his wife, his mountain. The days passed in peaceful rhythm, sunrise to sunset, season to season. He knew nothing of the prophecy that had condemned him to death. He knew nothing of the royal blood that flowed in his veins. He was simply Paris, shepherd of Ida, and that was enough. Until the morning the world changed. It began with a strange quality to the light. Paris noticed it as he led his flock to their usual pasture. A golden shimmer that seemed to hang in the air like dust motes but moved with purpose, with direction. The sheep noticed it too, growing restless, bleeding with an anxiety they could not explain. Then, the light coalesced. It gathered itself, took form, became three figures of such overwhelming beauty that Paris felt his knees weaken and his heart forget how to beat. They were women, but not women. They were something more, something beyond, something that the human mind could barely process. They stood before him, radiant as suns, terrible as storms, and Paris understood with immediate, instinctive certainty that he was in the presence of gods. Hermes appeared beside him, though Paris had not seen him arrive. The messenger god seemed amused, his winged sandals barely touching the grass, his caduceus twirling lazily in his fingers. "Paris of Troy," Hermes said, and the shepherd flinched at the name he had never heard before. "Or Paris of Ida, if you prefer. The gods have a task for you." He explained the situation with divine efficiency. The golden apple, the three goddesses, the dispute that threatened to tear Olympus apart, and the solution that Zeus had devised. Let Paris judge. Let Paris decide which of these three beings of impossible beauty was the fairest of them all. Paris wanted to refuse. Every instinct he had screamed that this was a trap, that no mortal could safely involve himself in the quarrels of gods. But Hermes was already gone, vanished as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving Paris alone with the three goddesses and their expectations. They regarded him with eyes that held the weight of eternity. And then, one by one, they began to speak. The queen of Olympus moved with a dignity that made mountains seem humble, with a presence that filled the meadow like a physical force. Her robes were the purple of royalty, edged with gold that caught the strange light and threw it back multiplied. A crown sat upon her brow, delicate as spider silk, but radiating power that made Paris's teeth ache. "Young shepherd," she said, and her voice was like distant thunder, beautiful and dangerous. "You see before you the queen of the gods, wife to Zeus himself, mistress of Olympus, protector of marriage and family and all that civilizes the world. Beauty I possess, yes, but beauty joined to power. Give me the apple, and I will give you something far more valuable than gold." She leaned closer, and Paris could smell her scent. Rain on hot stone, flowers blooming in hidden gardens. "I will make you king," Hera whispered. "Not king of shepherds, not king of this mountain, king of all Asia, emperor of lands that stretch from sea to sea. Nations will bow before you. Armies will march at your command. History will remember your name when the stars themselves have burned to cinders. This is what I offer. This is what awaits you, if you choose wisely." She stepped back, confident, regal, certain that her offer could not be refused. Athena came forward next. The goddess of wisdom wore armor that gleamed like captured moonlight, fitted so perfectly to her form that it seemed grown rather than forged. Her eyes were gray as storm clouds, sharp as the spear she carried, missing nothing, weighing everything. An owl sat upon her shoulder, its gaze as penetrating as its mistress's. "The queen offers you power," Athena acknowledged, "but power without wisdom is a curse. Kings rise and fall. Empires crumble to dust. What remains is what the mind achieves, what the hands create, what wisdom builds that brute force can never destroy." She studied Paris with those terrible, intelligent eyes, and he felt himself being measured, evaluated, found wanting in ways he could not understand. "I offer you knowledge," Athena continued, "wisdom beyond anything mortal minds have touched. You will understand the movements of the stars. You will know the secrets of bronze and iron, of architecture and agriculture, of war and peace and everything between. No battle will find you unprepared. No problem will prove unsolvable. You will become the wisest mortal who has ever lived, and your wisdom will echo through the ages long after lesser kings are forgotten." She stepped back, calm, confident in the value of her offer. And then there was Aphrodite. She did not step forward so much as drift, like a flower petal carried on a warm breeze. She wore almost nothing, veils of fabric so thin they seemed woven from suggestion rather than thread. Her beauty was not the cold perfection of Hera or the sharp brilliance of Athena. It was warmth. It was desire. It was the ache that lives in every heart that has ever loved or longed to love. "My sisters offer you thrones and thoughts," Aphrodite murmured, and her voice was honey and wine, a sound that seemed to touch Paris rather than merely reach his ears. "But what are crowns to a man who sleeps alone? What is wisdom to a heart that has never truly known love?" She moved closer, close enough that Paris could feel the heat radiating from her divine flesh, could see the subtle movement of her breath. "I offer you love, Paris, the most beautiful woman in the world. Yours to hold, yours to cherish, Helen of Sparta, whose face men would die merely to glimpse, whose hand would launch armadas, whose heart has never been truly won. Give me the apple, and Helen will be yours. Not through force, not through deception, but through love itself. She will love you as you will love her, with a passion that will make the gods themselves jealous." Paris looked at the three goddesses. He thought of power, of armies at his command, of an empire stretching to the horizon. He thought of wisdom, of understanding secrets that had eluded all mortals before him, of a legacy built on knowledge rather than conquest. And then he thought of love, of a woman so beautiful that her face alone was worth more than kingdoms, of feeling, truly feeling, the warmth of connection that he had glimpsed with Inoni but never fully understood. He was young. He was foolish. He was human. Paris reached out his hand and placed the golden apple in Aphrodite's waiting palm. Hera's eyes went cold. Athena's hand tightened on her spear, but neither goddess spoke. They simply looked at Paris with expressions that contained no anger, no disappointment, nothing so simple as human emotion. They looked at him the way one might look at an insect that had wandered onto a path where it did not belong. Then they were gone. The strange light faded. The sheep resumed their grazing as if nothing had happened. Only Aphrodite remained, for just a moment longer. She smiled at Paris, and her smile contained promises and warnings in equal measure. "You have chosen well," she said. "Or perhaps you have chosen poorly. We shall see. But know this, Paris of Troy, I keep my promises. Helen will be yours. What happens after that? Well, That is where stories become interesting, is it not? Then she too vanished, leaving Paris alone on his mountain, the golden apple gone, the judgment rendered, and somewhere in distant Sparta, a woman named Helen living her last days of peace, without knowing that her fate had already been decided, by a shepherd she had never met, on a mountain she had never seen. The breeze returned to Mount Ida. The birds resumed their singing. The sun continued its patient arc across the sky. But nothing at all, would ever be the same. The beauty of Helen was not something that could be described in the ordinary way one might describe a beautiful woman. It was not a matter of cataloging features, of noting the curve of a lip or the color of an eye. Poets would try, of course, for 3,000 years. Poets would try to capture in words what Helen's presence did to those who beheld her. They would speak of golden hair and ivory skin, of eyes that held the depth of summer skies, of a form so perfect that sculptors wept knowing they could never reproduce it in marble. But all of these descriptions missed the essential truth of Helen's beauty. It was not what she looked like. It was what she made you feel. When Helen entered a room, the air itself seemed to change. Conversations faltered and died. Men who had been arguing fell silent. Women who had been laughing stopped mid-breath. Every eye turned toward her, not because people chose to look, but because they could not choose otherwise. Her beauty was a force, a gravity, a pull that operated on something deeper than conscious thought. Some said it was a gift from Aphrodite, a blessing bestowed upon a mortal woman to demonstrate the goddess's power. Others whispered that Helen was not entirely mortal at all, that Zeus himself had fathered her, taking the form of a swan to seduce her mother Leda. Perhaps both stories were true, perhaps neither. What mattered was the effect, and the effect was undeniable. Helen had known she was beautiful from the moment she was old enough to understand what beauty meant. She had seen it in the way servants looked at her, in the way visitors to her father's palace stumbled over their own feet when she passed. She had learned, very young, that her face was both a gift and a curse. It opened doors and created opportunities. It also made her a prize to be won, a treasure to be possessed, a thing, rather than a person, in the eyes of too many men. By the time she reached marriageable age, suitors had come from every corner of the Greek world. Kings and princes, warriors and poets, men of every description who had heard of the most beautiful woman in existence, and needed to see for themselves if the stories were true. They camped outside her father Tyndareus's palace in Sparta. They brought gifts of gold and cattle, of horses and weapons, of promises so elaborate they would take lifetimes to fulfill. Tyndareus was not a foolish man. He looked at the gathered suitors, counted their armies, calculated their ambitions, and saw disaster looming. If he chose one man to marry his daughter, he would make an enemy of every other. The rejected suitors would not simply go home and forget. They would rage. They would ally with each other. They would make war upon Sparta and upon whichever man had been chosen, and the blood that followed would be on Tyndareus's hands. It was Odysseus who provided the solution. Odysseus of Ithaca was among the suitors, though he had little real hope of winning Helen's hand. He was clever rather than wealthy, cunning rather than powerful. His island kingdom was rocky and poor compared to the great powers represented in the gathering. But Odysseus saw things that others missed. He understood people in ways that seemed almost supernatural. And he understood that Tyndareus's problem was really an opportunity in disguise. He went to the king privately, late one evening, when the other suitors were drinking and boasting in the great hall. "I can solve your dilemma," Odysseus said. if you will do something for me in return. Tyndareus was desperate enough to listen. Make every suitor swear an oath, Odysseus explained. Before you announce your choice, before anyone knows who will win Helen's hand, make them all swear to defend her marriage. Whoever she marries, all the others must pledge to protect that union. If anyone ever tries to take Helen from her husband, every man who swore the oath must come to her defense. It was elegant, it was simple, and it transformed the suitors from potential enemies into guaranteed allies. The man who married Helen would not face the jealousy of the rejected. He would command their loyalty, bound by sacred vows that no honorable Greek could break. And what do you want in return? Tyndareus asked. Your niece, Odysseus replied. Penelope. I have no hope of winning Helen, but Penelope, she I might deserve. Help me win her hand, and the oath is yours. Tyndareus agreed. The next day he gathered all the suitors together and demanded their pledge. One by one, they swore upon the sacred symbols of sacrifice, upon the blood and bones of a horse they had slaughtered for the occasion. They bound themselves with words that could not be unsaid, promises that would echo across decades and destroy everything they touched. None of them knew, as they spoke those solemn words, that they were sealing their own fates. None of them could imagine that this oath, sworn in a moment of competitive desperation, would one day drag them all to the shores of distant Troy and hold them there for 10 years of blood and suffering. The gods have a sense of irony that mortals rarely appreciate until it is far too late. With the oath secured, Tyndareus announced his choice. Helen would marry Menelaus, brother of the mighty Agamemnon who ruled Mycenae, the greatest power in all of Greece. It was a political decision as much as anything else. Menelaus was not the most dashing of the suitors, not the most eloquent, or the most handsome, but his brother's power guaranteed that Helen would be protected, that Sparta would be allied with the strongest kingdom in the land. Helen accepted the decision with the grace she showed in all things. What she felt privately, whether she loved Menelaus or merely tolerated him, whether she dreamed of different choices or accepted her fate with genuine contentment, the ancient sources do not say. She was a prize that had been awarded. Her feelings were not considered relevant. The wedding was magnificent. The oath-bound suitors attended, honoring the man they had sworn to protect, hiding whatever disappointment or resentment they felt behind masks of celebration. Helen was radiant. Of course, she could not be otherwise. Menelaus looked upon his bride with an expression of wonder that never entirely faded, the expression of a man who could not quite believe his fortune. For 9 years, their marriage was peaceful. Menelaus proved to be a kind husband, if not a passionate one. He treated Helen with respect, with devotion, with the careful attention a man might show a priceless artifact he fears he might accidentally break. They had a daughter, Hermione, who inherited her mother's beauty in slightly diluted form. They ruled Sparta together, and if there was no great love between them, there was at least stability, at least contentment, at least the absence of obvious unhappiness. Helen tended her household. She wove at her loom, creating tapestries of remarkable beauty. She performed the rituals expected of a queen, honoring the gods with offerings and prayers. She watched her daughter grow and wondered, sometimes, what other lives she might have lived if her face had been ordinary, if her beauty had not made her a piece on a board where gods and men played games she could not control. And then, one spring morning, a ship appeared on the horizon. It came from the east, from across the wide Aegean, its sails purple as bruises, his prow carved in the shape of a great bird. The ship anchored in the harbor at Gythian, and messengers rode to the palace announcing that a prince of Troy had come to pay his respects to the king and queen of Sparta. His name was Paris. Menelaus received the Trojan prince with all the hospitality that Greek custom demanded. A guest was sacred, a guest from a foreign kingdom, bearing gifts and speaking words of friendship, was doubly sacred. The laws of Zeus himself protected travelers, and Menelaus was a pious man who would never dream of violating those laws. Paris was everything a prince should be. He was handsome, though in a softer way than the Greek warriors Menelaus was accustomed to. His manners were impeccable, his speech elegant, his gifts generous beyond expectation. He brought gold from the mines of Phrygia, textiles dyed in colors the Greeks had never seen, spices that perfumed the entire palace with their exotic fragrance. He said he had come to honor the alliance between Troy and Sparta, to strengthen the bonds between East and West, to see for himself the legendary kingdom he had heard so much about. All of this was true, in its way, but it was not the whole truth, and Paris knew it, and somewhere in the depths of Olympus, Aphrodite smiled, as the threads of fate began to weave themselves into the pattern she had promised. The first time Paris saw Helen, he understood why wars might be fought over beauty. She entered the great hall during the welcoming feast, and everything Paris thought he knew about desire was revealed as pale shadow compared to blinding truth. He had loved Oenone on Mount Ida. He had thought he understood what love meant. But Oenone's gentle prettiness was a candle flame next to Helen's blazing sun. Helen saw Paris at the same moment, and something shifted in her expression. Something she had kept carefully controlled for 9 years of marriage flickered briefly in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or destiny, or simply the first stirrings of a feeling she would spend the rest of her life trying to understand. The feast continued. Wine was poured and drunk. Stories were told and songs were sung. Paris charmed everyone with his wit and his grace. Menelaus grew to like this Trojan prince, this cultured visitor from a world so different from his own warrior society. He invited Paris to stay as long as he wished. His house was Paris's house. His hospitality had no limits. 9 days passed. 9 days of feasting and hunting, of conversations that stretched long into the night, of moments when Paris and Helen found themselves alone together in gardens or corridors, speaking of things that meant nothing and everything simultaneously. Their words were innocent. Their eyes were not. On the 10th day, messengers arrived from Crete. Menelaus's grandfather had died, and his presence was required at the funeral rites. Duty called him away from Sparta, away from his guest, away from his wife. He hesitated, some instinct warning him that something was wrong. But the laws of hospitality were clear. A guest must be treated with honor even in the host's absence. And surely, a prince of Troy could be trusted. Menelaus sailed for Crete, leaving Paris alone in his palace with his wife and his servants, and all the treasures of the Spartan kingdom. What happened next has been debated for 3,000 years. Some say Paris seduced Helen, wielding Aphrodite's gift like a weapon, overcoming her virtue with supernatural allure she could not resist. Some say he abducted her, taking her by force onto his purple-sailed ship while she wept and struggled and called for help that never came. Some say Helen went willingly, that she chose Paris, that she looked at her comfortable life with steady Menelaus, and decided she wanted something more, something dangerous, something that made her feel alive in ways her royal routine never could. Perhaps the truth contained elements of all these stories. Perhaps Helen was both victim and accomplice, both seduced and choosing, caught between forces she could not control, and making decisions she would spend the rest of her life defending or regretting. What is certain is this: when Menelaus returned from Crete, his palace was emptier than he had left it. His treasury had been plundered, gold and silver and precious objects vanishing with the Trojan ship. His servants could only stammer confused accounts of a departure in the night, of their queen boarding the foreign vessel with her handmaidens and her belongings. His wife was gone. Helen of Sparta had become Helen of Troy, and the oath that Odysseus had crafted so cleverly 9 years before was about to bear its terrible fruit. Menelaus's grief transformed quickly into rage. He did not weep for his lost wife. He roared for vengeance. He sent messengers racing across Greece to every king and prince who had sworn the sacred oath, demanding that they fulfill their promise. Someone had taken Helen. Someone had violated the marriage they had all sworn to protect. Honor demanded response. The oath demanded war. The messengers reached Mycenae first, where Agamemnon sat upon the throne of the greatest kingdom in Greece. Menelaus's brother listened to the news with an expression that combined sympathy with calculation. He loved his brother, certainly, but he was also a king, and kings saw opportunities where others saw only grievances. Troy was wealthy. Troy controlled the strait connecting the Aegean to the Black Sea, taxing every ship that passed through those crucial waters. Troy's fall would benefit Greek merchants, Greek traders, Greek kingdoms that had long resented paying tribute to an Eastern power. This abduction, this insult, this violation of sacred hospitality, it was not merely a personal matter. It was a justification. Agamemnon agreed to lead the expedition. He would gather the oath-bound kings. He would assemble a fleet such as the world had never seen. He would sail to Troy and demand Helen's return, and if the Trojans refused, he would tear their city down, stone by stone, until nothing remained but dust and memory. The messengers spread across Greece like wildfire. In Pylos, aged Nestor heard the call and began preparing his ships, his old heart stirring with memories of adventures in his youth. In Crete, Idomeneus gathered his warriors, eager to test Cretan spears against Trojan walls. In Salamis, great Ajax polished his massive shield and smiled at the prospect of worthy enemies to fight. But 2 of the greatest heroes of the age did not answer the call with enthusiasm. 2 men who had sworn the oath found themselves wishing, desperately, that they had never set foot near Tyndareus's palace. 2 men began plotting ways to escape the fate that was reaching for them with bloody hands. Odysseus of Ithaca had finally achieved everything he wanted. His clever bargain had won him Penelope, exactly as he had hoped. Their marriage was not the cold political arrangement that characterized so many royal unions. They loved each other with a depth and intensity that surprised even themselves. They talked for hours, finishing each other's thoughts, understanding each other in ways that seemed almost telepathic. And now, they had a son. Telemachus had been born just months before the messengers arrived. A healthy boy who had his father's clever eyes and his mother's gentle smile. Odysseus held his son and felt something he had never experienced before. A love so fierce it frightened him. A determination to protect this small life that overwhelmed every other consideration. He could not go to war. He could not leave Penelope alone with their infant son. He could not risk dying on some foreign shore while his boy grew up never knowing his father's face. The oath he had invented, the clever solution he had been so proud of, had become a noose around his own neck. So Odysseus did what Odysseus always did when faced with an impossible situation. He found a clever way around it. When the messengers arrived at Ithaca, they found the king engaged in very strange behavior. He had yoked a donkey and an ox together, a combination that made no agricultural sense. He was plowing a field on the beach, driving this mismatched team through sand that could grow nothing. And as he plowed, he was sowing salt into the furrows, muttering to himself in a language no one could understand. Odysseus, it seemed, had gone mad. The messengers were not fools, but they were not Odysseus's equals in cunning either. They watched the king's bizarre performance and began to believe it. Perhaps the pressure of his new responsibilities had broken something in his mind. Perhaps the gods had cursed him for some unknown offense. Either way, a madman could not be held to an oath. A madman was useless in war. But among the messengers was Palamedes, a prince whose intelligence rivaled Odysseus's own. He watched the plowing, watched the salt sowing, watched the careful performance of insanity, and he was not convinced. The furrows were too straight. The movements were too deliberate. This was not madness. This was theater. Palamedes walked to where Penelope stood watching with the infant Telemachus in her arms. Without warning, he seized the baby and placed him directly in the path of the oncoming plow. Odysseus saw his son in the sand before him. He saw the donkey and ox bearing down on the tiny body. And in that moment, every pretense of madness evaporated. He hauled on the reins, turning the animals sharply aside, saving his child from the hooves and the blade. Palamedes smiled. "I thought so," he said. "A madman would not know his own son. A madman would not care if he lived or died. You are as sane as I am, Odysseus of Ithaca, and you are bound by your oath." Odysseus looked at his son, safe now in Penelope's trembling arms. He looked at Palamedes, and something cold and patient settled into his heart. He would go to Troy. He had no choice now, but he would remember this moment. He would remember Palamedes, and the threat to his child, and the humiliation of being caught in his own deception. Someday, Odysseus promised himself, Palamedes would pay for what he had done today. The payment would be slow, and it would be terrible, and it would come when Palamedes least expected it. But that is a story for another time. The island of Skyros lay far from the usual shipping routes, a quiet place of fishing villages and rocky shores, where nothing much ever happened and nothing much ever changed. It was the perfect place to hide something precious, or someone. Thetis, the sea goddess who had married Peleus at that fateful wedding where everything began, had known from the moment of her son's birth that he was special. Achilles was stronger than other children, faster, more beautiful. By the time he could walk, he could outrun grown men. By the time he could talk, he was asking questions that philosophers could not answer. He was everything a mother could hope for, and everything a mother could fear, because Thetis knew, as only an immortal can know, what fate had in store for her son. Achilles could choose one of two destinies. He could live a long, peaceful life, growing old in his father's kingdom, surrounded by children and grandchildren, dying eventually in his bed with his family gathered around him. His name would be forgotten within a generation or two. Just another minor king in a world full of minor kings. Or he could go to war. If Achilles went to Troy, he would become the greatest warrior the world had ever known. His name would be sung for thousands of years. Poets would compose epics about his deeds. He would become immortal in the only way that truly mattered, living forever in the memory of humanity. But he would die young. He would never see his son grow to manhood. He would fall on foreign soil, far from home, and all his strength and speed and beauty would drain away into the uncaring earth. Thetis had tried to protect him. When he was an infant, she had dipped him in the river Styx, the boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead. The waters of Styx conferred invulnerability on anything they touched. But she had held him by the heel, and that small patch of flesh had remained dry, remained mortal, remained vulnerable. One weakness, that was all fate needed. When word came that the Greeks were gathering to sail for Troy, that messengers were seeking every warrior who might contribute to the expedition, Thetis acted immediately. She took Achilles to Skyros, to the court of King Lycomedes, and she disguised him. She dressed him in women's clothing, taught him to walk differently, to speak differently, to hide everything that made him who he was. Achilles became Pyrrha, just another lady in waiting among the princess's companions. It was a ridiculous disguise. In some ways, Achilles was tall and broad-shouldered, with the build of a warrior despite his youth. His hands were too large, his feet too heavy, his voice too deep no matter how he tried to soften it. But Skyros was remote, and Lycomedes asked no questions, and the princess seemed pleased with her new companion, perhaps too pleased, if certain rumors were to be believed. For a time, it worked. The recruiting parties came and went. Finding no trace of the young warrior everyone said would be essential to victory at Troy. Achilles chafed at his confinement, at the restriction of female garments, at the pretense that denied everything he was. But he stayed because his mother begged him to stay, and because part of him, a small secret part, was afraid of what going to Troy would mean. Then Odysseus arrived. The king of Ithaca had been forced into this war against his will, but once committed, he pursued victory with the same cleverness he brought to everything else. He knew that the Greeks needed Achilles. The prophecies were clear. Without the son of Peleus, Troy would never fall. If Achilles could not be found, the entire expedition was doomed before it began. So Odysseus went looking. He heard rumors about Skyros, about a tall young woman among Lycomedes' court who moved strangely and kept to herself. He sailed to the island with a carefully prepared plan and a chest full of carefully selected items. Odysseus presented himself at court as a merchant, offering goods for sale to the ladies of the palace. He spread his wares across the great hall, fine fabrics and delicate jewelry, perfumes and combs, and all the things that women were supposed to desire. But hidden among these feminine trinkets were other items: a sword of exceptional quality, a shield polished to mirror brightness, a spear with a shaft of ash and a point of gleaming bronze. The ladies gathered around, exclaiming over the jewelry, holding fabrics up to the light. Odysseus watched them all carefully, paying particular attention to the tall one who stood at the back, whose eyes kept drifting away from the silks and toward the weapons. Then Odysseus gave a signal. Outside the hall, his men began making noise, shouting war cries, clashing weapons together, creating the sound of an attack. It was fake, of course, but the women did not know that. They screamed, they fled. They did what anyone would do when violence suddenly erupted. All except one. The tall woman in the back did not run. Instead, she lunged for the weapons, seized the sword and shield in hands that knew exactly how to hold them, and spun toward the door with a battle cry that shook dust from the rafters. Achilles stood revealed, sword raised, eyes blazing with a light that had nothing feminine about it. Odysseus smiled. "There you are," he said. "We have been looking for you." Achilles lowered the sword slowly, realizing what had happened. Understanding that his disguise was useless now, he looked at Odysseus with an expression that mixed anger and relief in equal measure. Part of him wanted to strike down this clever king who had tricked him. Part of him wanted to thank the man for freeing him from a prison of women's clothes and pretended helplessness. "The war," Achilles said. "It was not a question." "The war," Odysseus confirmed. "Troy, glory, everything the poets will sing about for 1,000 years. Is waiting for you, son of Peleus. All you have to do is come." Achilles thought of his mother's warnings. He thought of the choice between long life and lasting fame. He thought of all the years he might live if he stayed hidden, all the quiet, peaceful years of growing old and being forgotten. Then, he thought of the sword in his hand, and how right it felt, and how wrong everything had felt when he was pretending to be something he was not. "I will come," Achilles said. Thetis wept when she heard. She begged him to reconsider, to let the Greeks sail without him, to choose life over glory. But Achilles had made his decision, and not even a goddess mother's tears could change it. He would go to Troy. He would become the greatest warrior of his age. And he would die young, far from home, just as prophecy foretold. But, oh, what a death it would be! What songs they would sing! What stories they would tell around fires on winter nights for 3,000 years and more. Some fates, Achilles decided, were worth accepting. Some prices were worth paying. He gathered his armor, his weapons, his myrmidons who had trained their whole lives for this moment. He boarded his ship and sailed to join the gathering fleet, leaving Skyros behind forever, leaving his mother's protection, sailing toward the destiny he had chosen. The face that had launched 1,000 ships would soon see those ships arrive, and nothing, for any of them, would ever be the same. The harbor at Aulis stretched like a curved blade along the Boeotian coast, its waters so still they might have been hammered from polished bronze. 1,000 ships lay at anchor there, their masts rising like a forest of stripped trees against the pale sky. The greatest fleet ever assembled in the history of the world sat motionless upon a motionless sea, and not a breath of wind stirred to set them free. The Greeks had come from every corner of their world. They had answered the oath, gathered their warriors, loaded their ships with provisions and weapons and all the supplies necessary for a long campaign. They had rowed to Aulis, the traditional gathering point for expeditions heading east, expecting to catch the summer winds that would carry them across the Aegean to the shores of distant Troy. But the winds had not come. Days passed, then weeks. The summer stretched on, hot and heavy and utterly still. The sea lay flat as a mirror, reflecting clouds that never moved, mocking the 1,000 ships that could not sail upon its surface. The warriors who had arrived eager for glory found themselves trapped in a limbo of waiting, their enthusiasm curdling slowly into frustration, their frustration fermenting into something darker. Agamemnon stood on the shore each morning, staring at the horizon as if he could summon wind through sheer force of will. He was the supreme commander, the king of kings, the man who had transformed a personal grievance into a continental expedition. The weight of leadership pressed upon him like physical stone. Every day of delay cost him supplies, cost him morale, cost him the fragile unity he had worked so hard to forge among proud and quarrelsome kings. The camps spread along the coast for miles, a temporary city of tents and cooking fires, of horses and chariots and restless men with nothing to do but wait. Fights broke out with increasing frequency. Wine ran low, then food, then patience. Some warriors began muttering that the gods themselves opposed this venture, that perhaps they should abandon the expedition and return to their homes. Calchas the seer walked among the camps, with eyes that saw things hidden from ordinary men. He watched the patterns of bird flight, examined the entrails of sacrificed animals, listened to the whispers that only prophets could hear. And what he heard filled him with dread. Agamemnon had offended Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, the protector of wild things, had been insulted by the King of Kings. Perhaps he had boasted of his hunting prowess, claiming to be her equal with bow and spear. Perhaps he had killed a sacred deer in one of her groves, spilling blood where blood should never be spilled. The ancient sources offer different explanations, but the result was the same. Artemis had sealed the winds. She held them prisoner in her divine hands, and she would not release them until she received proper payment. Calchas brought the news to Agamemnon in his tent, speaking the words in a voice that trembled despite his prophetic authority. The king listened with a face that grew progressively paler, his hands gripping the arms of his chair until his knuckles went white. The price Artemis demanded was not gold. It was not cattle or horses or any of the things that men typically offered to appease angry gods. Artemis demanded blood. Specifically, she demanded the blood of Agamemnon's eldest daughter. Iphigenia must die on the goddess's altar. Only then would the winds blow. Only then could the fleet sail. Only then could the war proceed. Agamemnon sat alone in his tent for 3 days after hearing the prophecy. He did not eat. He barely slept. His mind turned the impossible choice over and over, examining it from every angle, searching desperately for some alternative that did not exist. He could refuse. He could tell Calchas that some prices were too high, that no war was worth a father's murder of his own child. He could disband the fleet, send the warriors home, abandon his brother's quest for vengeance. The oath would remain unfulfilled. Helen would remain in Troy, and Agamemnon would return to Mycenae with his daughter alive, and his honor in ruins. Or he could pay the price. He thought of Menelaus, his brother, whose wife had been stolen by a foreign prince. He thought of the oath that bound 1,000 warriors to this cause, the sacred promises that could not be broken without divine punishment. He thought of his own reputation, his position as supreme commander, the political alliances that would shatter if he showed weakness now. And he thought of Iphigenia, his firstborn, the daughter who had learned to walk by holding his fingers, the girl who used to climb into his lap and demand stories about heroes and monsters, the young woman she had become, beautiful and kind, and completely innocent of any crime that might justify her death. On the 4th day, Agamemnon summoned his heralds and gave them a message to carry to Mycenae. The message was a lie. It told Clytemnestra, his wife, that arrangements had been made for Iphigenia to marry Achilles, the greatest warrior of the age, the hero whose name was already legendary, wished to take her as his bride before sailing to Troy. She must come immediately. The wedding would take place at Aulis, and then the fleet would depart. It was the cruelest deception imaginable. Agamemnon used the promise of his daughter's greatest happiness to lure her to her death. He wrapped murder in wedding clothes and sent it home to the wife who trusted him. Clytemnestra received the message with joy. She dressed Iphigenia in the finest robes they owned, wove flowers into her hair, adorned her with jewelry that had been passed down through generations of queens. Mother and daughter traveled to Aulis together, their hearts full of excitement, their minds filled with visions of the celebration to come. The army watched them arrive. Some of the warriors knew the truth by then. Word had spread through the camps, as word always does, carried by whispers that could not be contained. They watched the queen and princess approach, with eyes that held pity and horror, and, in some cases, a grim acceptance of what necessity demanded. Achilles knew nothing of the deception, until he heard his name being spoken in connection with a marriage he had never agreed to. He stormed to Agamemnon's tent, furious at being used as bait in this trap, demanding to know what madness had possessed the king. But by then, it was too late. By then, Clytemnestra had learned the truth. The scene that followed was beyond description, beyond the capacity of words to capture. A mother discovering that she had brought her child to be slaughtered. A daughter realizing that her wedding dress was actually a burial shroud. The screaming, the begging, the desperate pleas that echoed across the silent harbor, while 1,000 warriors turned their faces away. Iphigenia was brave. In the end, when she understood that nothing could change her fate, that her father would not relent, that the army would not intervene, she stopped struggling. She walked to the altar with her head held high, determined to meet death with the dignity befitting a princess of Mycenae. Some say Artemis relented at the last moment. Some say the goddess, moved by the girl's courage, substituted a deer for Iphigenia on the altar, and spirited the princess away to serve as her priestess in a distant land. Others say this version is merely wishful thinking, a story told to make the horror easier to bear. What is certain is this: the knife fell, blood spilled across the altar, and, within hours, the winds began to blow. They came from the west, strong and steady, filling the sails of 1,000 ships. The sea that had been still as death suddenly churned with whitecaps. The warriors broke camp with unseemly haste, eager to leave this cursed shore, to put distance between themselves and the memory of what had been done here. Clytemnestra stood on the beach as the fleet departed, watching her husband's ship grow smaller against the horizon. Her face was stone. Her eyes were flame. In her heart, something had broken that could never be repaired, and something else had taken root that would grow for 10 long years until it bloomed into vengeance. Agamemnon had paid the price for his war, but prices have a way of compounding. Interest accrues. Debts come due when least expected. The fleet sailed east, toward Troy, toward glory, toward 10 years of blood and suffering. Behind them, on the shore at Aulis, the altar still stood, dark stains soaking into stone, that would remember what had happened here long after everyone involved had turned to dust. The winds blew, the ships sailed, and the war, purchased at such terrible cost, was finally, irrevocably, begun. The crossing was not kind to the Greek fleet. The same winds that had finally released them from Aulis proved capricious and cruel once the ships were at sea. Storms scattered the 1,000 vessels across the Aegean. Ships lost sight of each other in the spray and darkness, each captain navigating as best he could toward a destination few of them had ever seen. Telephus fell before they even reached Troy. The Greeks, driven off course by contrary winds, made landfall in Mysia, a kingdom on the Asian coast far south of their intended destination. In the confusion of arrival, in the chaos of a beach landing conducted by exhausted and disoriented warriors, they mistook the Mysians for Trojans. Battle was joined before anyone could correct the error. Telephus, king of Mysia, led his people in defense of their homeland. He was a formidable warrior in his own right, son of Heracles, inheritor of a hero's strength and courage. The fighting was fierce and bloody. Greeks and Mysians cutting each other down in the surf while seabirds screamed overhead. Achilles and Telephus met on the battlefield. Their duel was brief but devastating, two champions of extraordinary skill trading blows that would have killed lesser men instantly. In the end, Achilles' spear found Telephus' thigh, opening a wound that dropped the Mysian king to his knees in the sand. Only then did the truth emerge. Only then did the Greeks realize they had attacked allies, had shed the blood of people who had done them no wrong. The battle sputtered to a halt, warriors on both sides lowering their weapons in shock and shame. Telephus' wound would not heal. Some said Achilles' spear carried a curse, or perhaps a blessing in disguise. The wound festered and spread, resisting every treatment the Mysian physicians could devise. Telephus suffered for months, the pain constant, the flesh refusing to close. An oracle eventually provided the answer. Only the one who had inflicted the wound could heal it. Telephus traveled to the Greek camp, humbling himself before the man who had crippled him, begging for relief from his endless agony. Achilles, perhaps feeling guilt for the mistaken battle, perhaps simply demonstrating the mercy that warriors sometimes showed to worthy opponents, scraped rust from his spear and applied it to the wound. The rust of Achilles' spear healed what the spear itself had broken. Telephus recovered, and in gratitude, he provided the Greeks with something invaluable: accurate directions to Troy. The fleet regrouped. Ships that had scattered across the Aegean found each other in predetermined harbors, their crews comparing stories of storms weathered and comrades lost. When the count was finally complete, they had lost dozens of vessels to the crossing, hundreds of warriors to drowning and accident and the mistaken battle in Mysia. But the core of the army remained intact. The greatest heroes of the age still stood ready for war. And now, finally, they knew exactly where they were going. The coast of the Troad appeared on the horizon at dawn, a dark line of land rising from the wine-dark sea. The warriors crowded the rails of their ships, straining for their first glimpse of the enemy they had traveled so far to face. Rumors had circulated throughout the fleet, tales of Troy's wealth and power, of walls that could not be breached and warriors who could not be defeated. Some of the Greeks felt fear, looking at that distant shore. Some felt excitement. Achilles felt something like recognition, as if he were arriving at a place he had always known he would come to, a stage that had been prepared for him since before his birth. The fleet anchored offshore, bobbing in the gentle swells while the commanders debated their approach. A prophecy hung over the moment. The first Greek to set foot on Trojan soil would be the first to die. The landing would claim a life before the war even properly began. The warriors looked at each other, courage and self-preservation warring in their hearts. To leap first from the ships would be to guarantee glory and death in the same instant. Who would pay that price? Who would be remembered forever as the man brave enough or foolish enough to lead the invasion? Protesilaus made the choice for all of them. He was not the greatest hero in the fleet. His name was not sung in the same breath as Achilles or Ajax or Odysseus. He was simply a warrior, a captain of men, a husband who had left a new bride weeping on the shore when he sailed for Troy. Perhaps he sought glory to match his more famous companions. Perhaps he simply acted without thinking, the impulse of a warrior seeing the battlefield before him. Protesilaus leaped from his ship, and his feet touched Trojan sand, and Hector's spear took him through the chest before he could draw his sword. The first death, the first of thousands. His body fell on the beach, blood mixing with salt water, eyes staring up at the sky of a land he had seen for perhaps 30 seconds. Behind him, The Greek army roared and surged forward, pouring from their ships in a wave of bronze and fury. The war for Troy had begun. Beyond the beaches where Greek warriors established their camp, beyond the plain that would soon be soaked with the blood of heroes, beyond the winding course of the river Scamander, the city of Troy rose like a dream of what cities could become. The walls came first, always the walls. They rose from the earth as if grown rather than built, massive blocks of stone fitted so precisely that a knife blade could not slip between them. Some said Poseidon himself had constructed these defenses, payment for a debt he owed to a former king. Others claimed Apollo had raised them, his divine hands shaping stone like clay. Whatever their origin, the walls of Troy had never been breached, had never been scaled, had never fallen to any enemy in all the centuries since their construction. They rose 60 feet into the air, thick enough for chariots to race along their tops, studded with towers that commanded views of the surrounding countryside. Gates of oak and bronze pierced the circuit at strategic intervals, each one massive enough to admit entire armies, each one capable of sealing shut against any force that mortal men could bring against them. Within those walls, a city flourished that rivaled anything the Greek world could offer. The streets of Troy were paved with fitted stone, swept clean each morning by servants whose families had performed this task for generations. Channels ran beneath the pavement, carrying fresh water from mountain springs to fountains that sang in every public square. Drainage systems whisked away waste and rainwater with an efficiency that Greeks, accustomed to muddy paths and open sewers, would have found almost miraculous. The houses of the common people were comfortable and well-built, with thick walls that kept out summer heat and winter cold, with gardens where vegetables grew and children played. The houses of the wealthy were palaces in miniature, their walls painted with scenes of gods and heroes, their floors covered with rugs woven in patterns that had taken decades to perfect, their tables laden with food and wine that spoke of prosperity extending back through countless generations. The palace of Priam dominated the city's highest point, a complex of buildings that had grown over centuries as each king added his own contribution to the royal residence. Columns of polished marble supported roofs of cedar brought from distant Lebanon, wood so fragrant that the entire palace smelled of forests and ancient things. Gold gleamed from every surface, not garishly but tastefully, the accumulated wealth of a kingdom that had profited from its position at the crossroads of the world. And everywhere, there was life. Merchants called their wares in the marketplaces, offering goods from every corner of the known world. Egyptian linen and Babylonian spices, copper from Cyprus and tin from the mysterious West, amber from the frozen North and incense from Arabia. Troy's position controlling the strait between the Aegean and the Black Sea had made it wealthy beyond measure. Every ship that passed through those narrow waters paid tribute to the city, and the tribute had accumulated over centuries into riches that seemed inexhaustible. Craftsmen worked in workshops that lined the lower streets, their hammers and looms and potter's wheels creating objects of such quality that Trojan goods were prized throughout the civilized world. Trojan bronze had a particular luster. Trojan textiles had a particular softness. Trojan pottery had a particular elegance. To own something made in Troy was to own something that spoke of refinement and taste. The smell of the city was a mixture of incense and cooking food, of horses and humans and the salt breeze that drifted up from the harbor. It was the smell of civilization, of people living together in density and relative harmony, of a social order that had evolved over generations to balance competing needs and desires. King Priam had ruled the city for nearly 50 years, and his reign had been, by any measure, successful. He had maintained peace with his neighbors, expanded trade with distant kingdoms, fathered enough children to ensure succession for generations to come. His hair had long since turned white. His face had weathered with age, but his eyes remained sharp and his judgment remained sound. He was not a warrior. Not anymore. The battles of his youth were distant memories now. Achievements that seemed to belong to someone else. These days, Priam preferred diplomacy to warfare, compromise to confrontation, the slow accumulation of advantages to the violent seizure of territory. He had built Troy's prosperity through patience and cunning, and he expected to leave his heirs a kingdom stronger than the one he had inherited. He had 50 sons, or thereabouts. The exact count varied depending on which sources you consulted. Legitimate sons, illegitimate sons, sons by his queen Hecuba and sons by various other women whose names history had not bothered to preserve. Not all of them were warriors. Not all of them were even particularly talented. But among them were some of the finest men of their generation. Hector was the eldest, the heir, the prince who would one day inherit his father's throne. Everything about Hector spoke of nobility, of honor, of the virtues that people associated with the best kind of leadership. He was tall and strong, a warrior of exceptional skill who had never been defeated in single combat. But his strength was tempered by wisdom, his courage by compassion. He cared for his soldiers. He loved his wife Andromache with a devotion that other men found almost embarrassing. He played with his infant son Astyanax with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his reputation on the battlefield. The people of Troy loved Hector with an intensity that went beyond normal respect for royalty. He was their champion, their defender, the embodiment of everything they believed their city represented. When Hector walked the streets, citizens called out blessings and children ran to touch his cloak. When Hector spoke in council, other men fell silent to listen. When Hector fought, Troy's enemies learned to fear. And then, there was Paris, the second son, the beautiful one, the prince who had returned from Mount Ida with memories of goddesses and promises and a golden apple's curse. Paris was everything his brother was not, charming where Hector was substantial, graceful where Hector was powerful, beloved by women and distrusted by men who sensed something unreliable beneath the pretty surface. He had come home some years ago, his true identity revealed through a series of events that the ancient sources describe differently. Some say he won athletic contests that proved his royal blood. Some say he was recognized by his sister Cassandra, whose prophetic gifts allowed her to see what others could not. However it happened, the shepherd of Ida had become Prince Paris of Troy, taking his place among Priam's many sons. And now he had brought Helen home with him, the most beautiful woman in the world, stolen or seduced from her Greek husband, installed in the palace as if she belonged there. Some Trojans thought Paris a romantic hero for winning such a prize. Others saw the Greek fleet gathering on the horizon and wondered if any woman was worth what was about to happen. Cassandra knew. Cassandra always knew. She wandered the palace corridors with wild eyes and wilder hair, speaking truths that no one believed. Apollo had given her the gift of prophecy and then cursed her so that her prophecies would never be heeded. She had seen Troy burning before Paris ever returned from Mount Ida. She had screamed warnings that were dismissed as madness, wept tears that were ignored as hysteria. Now she stood on the walls of Troy, watching the Greek ships multiply on the beach below, watching the enemy camp spread across the plain like a disease. She saw the future unfolding with terrible clarity, the battles and the deaths, the heroes rising and falling, the wooden horse and the final night of flames. But when she opened her mouth to warn her family, the curse transformed her words into nonsense. The listeners heard only the ravings of a mad woman. They patted her hand and led her away from the walls, back to her chambers, where she could rage at the future in privacy. Troy prepared for war. Weapons were sharpened and armor polished. Supplies were stockpiled against a potential siege. The great gates were reinforced. The walls were manned. The city's famous defenses were readied for the test they had never failed. From his throne, Priam watched the preparations with the calm of a man who had seen many threats come and go. The Greeks were numerous. Yes, the Greeks were angry. Yes, but Troy's walls had never fallen. Troy's warriors had never failed. The gods themselves seemed to favor the city above all others. Surely, Priam thought, surely this threat would pass like all the others. Surely his city would endure. He could not see Cassandra, alone in her chamber, weeping for the future that no one would believe. He could not hear the whisper of fate, already counting down the years until everything he had built would burn. 9 years is a long time to wait for a war to end. In the first months, the Greek warriors had attacked Troy's walls with the fury of men who expected quick victory. They had thrown themselves against those ancient stones with ladders and ropes, with battering rams and siege towers hastily constructed from timber felled in the nearby forests. The walls had held. The walls always held. And slowly, inevitably, the nature of the conflict changed from assault to attrition, from the sprint of conquest to the marathon of siege. The Greek camp became a city of its own, sprawling along the beach in a chaotic maze of tents and shelters and semi-permanent structures that grew more permanent with each passing season. What had begun as a temporary encampment evolved into something that resembled a rough settlement, complete with marketplaces where captured goods were traded, with shrines where soldiers prayed for survival and victory, with sections that belonged to different contingents and developed their own characters and customs. The Myrmidons camped apart from the others, their discipline and arrogance setting them aside as much as their fierce reputation. Ajax and his Salaminians occupied a stretch of beach near the center of the line, their massive shields propped against wooden frames when not in use. Odysseus and his Ithacans were positioned at the far end, as far from the fighting as possible, a placement some saw as prudent and others as cowardly. Between the camp and the city stretched the plain of Troy, a wide expanse of grassland crossed by the winding Scamander River. This plain became the battlefield, the killing ground, the arena where heroes proved themselves and ordinary men died by the thousands. Day after day, season after season, the armies met on this plain in engagements that decided nothing, that moved no boundaries, that served only to add more bodies to the pyres that burned each evening. The rhythm of war settled into something almost predictable. Dawn brought the armies forth from their respective shelters, bronze armor gleaming in the early light, spears bristling like fields of deadly grain. They would clash somewhere on the plain, fighting through the heat of the day, retreating as darkness fell to count their dead and tend their wounded. The next day, they would do it again. Heroes emerged from this grinding conflict, men whose names would be remembered long after the ordinary soldiers had been forgotten. Diomedes of Argos fought with such fury that he wounded Aphrodite herself when she tried to protect her favorites. Ajax stood like a tower in the thickest fighting, his massive shield protecting not just himself but the men who fought beside him. Odysseus proved himself invaluable in the countless small conflicts that characterized siege warfare, his cunning finding solutions where brute force failed. And always, there was Achilles. When Achilles took the field, the Trojans learned to recognize his armor from a distance, his plumed helmet visible above the chaos of battle. They learned to flee when they saw him coming, learned that standing against the son of Peleus meant death as certain as sunset. He moved through combat like a force of nature, his spear finding throats and hearts with mechanical precision, his sword opening paths through packed enemy formations. But even Achilles could not take Troy's walls. Even his divine speed and strength were useless against 60 feet of fitted stone. He could slaughter Trojans by the dozen on the plain, but as long as they could retreat behind their defenses, as long as those walls remained unbreached, the war could not be won. So the Greeks adapted. If they could not take Troy directly, they would weaken it indirectly. They would cut off its allies, raid its supply lines, strangle the city economically while maintaining pressure militarily. Achilles became the instrument of this strategy, leading expeditions against the smaller cities that supported Troy, returning with plunder and prisoners that enriched the Greek camp while impoverishing the enemy. The coastal cities fell one by one. Lyrnessus, Pedasos, Thebe. Each conquest brought wealth in gold and bronze, in cattle and horses, in captive women who were distributed among the Greek leaders according to their rank and contribution. The priests of captured temples were interrogated for information about Trojan defenses. The craftsmen were put to work repairing Greek equipment. The women became slaves, concubines, prizes that demonstrated the success of the campaign. But Troy itself remained untouched, untouchable. Its walls as formidable in the 9th year as they had been in the 1st. The men who had sailed from Aulis as young warriors were growing older now. Gray appeared in beards that had been black or brown. Scars accumulated on bodies that had once been unmarked. The memory of home, of wives and children and the simple pleasures of peacetime life, became a constant ache that no amount of victory could satisfy. They gathered around fires at night, these aging warriors, and spoke of the lives they had left behind. Some had married just before departure, their brides barely known before the separation that had now lasted nearly a decade. Some had children they had never seen, sons and daughters born after the fleet sailed, growing up with fathers who existed only as stories and memories. Some had parents who might already be dead, estates that might have fallen into ruin, entire lives that had continued without them. The wine helped, for a while. The Greeks drank heavily in those 9 years, drowning their homesickness and fear in cups that were never quite empty. The captured wine from Trojan allies was particularly prized, rich and sweet and capable of producing a forgetfulness that felt almost like peace. The women helped too, for some. The captives who had been distributed as prizes provided comfort of a sort, though it was the comfort of conquerors, complicated by questions of consent and power that the Greeks did not bother to examine too closely. Some men took these women as true companions, treating them with something approaching respect. Others used them and discarded them with the callousness that war breeds in hearts grown accustomed to death. Sickness swept through the camp periodically, mysterious illnesses that killed more men than Trojan spears. The latrines were inadequate for a population that had never been meant to stay so long. The drinking water came from streams that also received the camp's waste. Flies bred in the refuse heaps, carrying diseases from the dead to the living. Men who had survived countless battles died shivering in their tents, conquered by enemies too small to see. Morale became a constant concern. Agamemnon spent as much time managing the fragile alliance of Greek kingdoms as he did planning military operations. The proud kings who had sworn to support Menelaus's cause had not expected to spend their best years camped on a foreign beach. They quarreled over the distribution of plunder. They argued about strategy and tactics. They threatened, periodically, to abandon the expedition entirely. Only the shame of leaving held them together. Only the knowledge that returning home without victory would brand them as failures, as oath-breakers, as men who had started something they could not finish. They had invested too much to quit. They had lost too many friends to simply sail away. And so they stayed, season after season, year after grinding year. The Trojans watched from their walls and waited. Time was their ally. Every month that passed without a breach, every season that turned while the walls held firm, increased the likelihood that the Greeks would eventually give up. Their own supplies were adequate if not abundant. Their walls were as strong as ever. If they could simply endure, simply outlast the enemy's patience, perhaps this threat would pass like all the others. Perhaps their city would endure. 9 years, 3,000 days of waiting and fighting and dying. An entire generation of young men transformed into veterans or corpses. And still the walls stood. Still the war continued. Still both sides clung to the hope that something would change, that some decisive moment would finally bring this endless conflict to its conclusion. That moment was coming. The 10th year would see more change than all the preceding years combined. But the men who huddled around their fires as the 9th year drew to a close could not know that yet. They knew only the weariness, the longing, the desperate hope that tomorrow might bring something different. Tomorrow would bring a plague. The sickness began with the animals. Mules died first, then the dogs that roamed the camp scavenging scraps and hunting rats. The Greeks barely noticed at first. Animals died all the time. The camp was not a healthy place for any living creature. But then, the men started falling. It began as fever, a burning heat that no amount of cold water could quench. Then came the chills, violent shaking that rattled teeth and made speech impossible. Sores appeared on the skin, angry red marks that spread and merged into patches of corruption. Men who had been strong in the morning were dead by nightfall. Their bodies carried to pyres that burned constantly now, filling the air with the sweet, sick smell of burning flesh. The plague spread through the camp like fire through dry grass. It showed no respect for rank or achievement. Common soldiers died beside famous warriors. Servants fell alongside the masters they served. The healers who tried to treat the sick became sick themselves, their knowledge useless against this invisible enemy. Agamemnon watched his army dying and felt the cold grip of fear around his heart. This was not battle, not warfare as he understood it. This was something worse, something that could not be fought with spears and shields, could not be defeated through courage or strategy. This was divine punishment, and the Greeks knew only too well which god was responsible. Apollo, the archer god, the lord of plague and healing alike, had turned his silver bow upon the Greek army. His arrows flew unseen through the camp, each one carrying death to another victim. The pyres burned day and night now, 9 days of constant fire, the smoke rising in columns that could be seen from Troy's walls. The Trojans must have known what was happening. They must have seen the smoke, heard the wailing, understood that their enemies were being destroyed by forces far more effective than any Trojan spear. But they did not attack. Perhaps they feared the plague would spread to them. Perhaps they simply preferred to let Apollo complete his work without interference. On the 10th day, when the bodies had piled so high that the army seemed more dead than alive, Achilles called an assembly. The warriors who could still stand gathered on the beach, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow with the particular emptiness of men who have watched friends die without being able to help. Achilles stood before them, healthy still, either blessed by his divine mother or simply lucky, and demanded that something be done. "We are dying," he said, and his voice carried across the assembly with the force of absolute conviction. "Not in battle, not with glory, but rotting in our tents like animals. If we are to perish here, let it be with spears in our hands." But I do not believe the gods intend us to die like this. There is a reason for this plague. There is a cure. We must find it. Calchas the seer stepped forward. The same prophet who had demanded Iphigenia's blood at Aulis. His face was troubled, his eyes avoiding Agamemnon's gaze. I know the reason, Calchas said, but I dare not speak it without protection. The truth I must tell will anger one of the most powerful men in this army. Unless Achilles swears to defend me, I will remain silent. Achilles swore. Whatever Calchas revealed, Achilles would protect him from retaliation. The prophet took a deep breath and spoke the truth that everyone had suspected but no one had dared to voice. Chryses was the cause. She was a young woman, daughter of Chryses, a priest of Apollo in one of the cities Achilles had sacked during the 9th year. She had been taken as a prize and awarded to Agamemnon as part of his share of the plunder. The King of Kings had become attached to her, had declared publicly that he preferred her to his own wife Clytemnestra, had refused to return her despite increasingly desperate pleas from her father. Chryses had prayed to Apollo. The god had listened, and now the Greek army was dying because Agamemnon would not give up a slave girl. The silence that followed Calchas' revelation was absolute. Every eye turned to Agamemnon, waiting to see how the supreme commander would respond to this accusation. The king's face had gone red, then white, cycling through emotions too quickly to identify. When he finally spoke, his voice shook with barely controlled rage. So I must give her up, Agamemnon said. I must lose my prize while everyone else keeps theirs. I must be diminished, humiliated, made less than the men I command. Is that what you're telling me, prophet? Is that what Apollo demands? The plague will not end otherwise, Calchas replied, his voice steady despite the fear visible in his eyes. Chryses must be returned to her father. Apollo must be appeased. There is no other way. Agamemnon looked at the assembly, at the gaunt faces of men who had followed him for 9 years, at warriors who had bled and suffered for his brother's cause. He saw their desperation, their fear, their growing anger at a leader who would let them die for the sake of his pride. Very well, he said finally. I will give up the girl, but I will not be the only one to lose what I have won. If my prize is taken from me, I will take another to replace her. From Ajax, perhaps, or Odysseus, or you, Achilles. Yes, perhaps I will take Briseis from the great Achilles. Would that not be fitting? The best of the Achaeans, giving up his prize to compensate his king. The words hung in the air like a challenge, like a slap, like a declaration of war between allies. Achilles' hand moved to his sword. The moment stretched like heated bronze, malleable and dangerous. Every warrior in the assembly held their breath, watching Achilles' fingers curl around his sword hilt, watching the muscles in his arm tense for the draw that would change everything. To kill Agamemnon here, now, in front of the assembled army, would be the end of the expedition. The alliance would shatter. The Greek kingdoms would turn on each other with all the violence they had directed at Troy. The war would be lost, not through Trojan victory, but through Greek self-destruction. But Achilles had been insulted. His honor had been challenged in the most public way possible. The greatest warrior of the age had been threatened with the loss of his prize, treated like a subordinate rather than the hero who had done more than any other to prosecute this war. For a man like Achilles, for whom honor was worth more than life itself, the insult demanded blood. His sword slid an inch from its scabbard. The bronze gleamed in the sunlight, hungry for use. Then, something happened that only Achilles could see. Athena appeared beside him, visible only to his eyes. her hand closing over his on the sword hilt. Her gray eyes met his, calm and commanding, filled with the wisdom that was her divine province. "Not this way," she whispered, and her voice carried the weight of divine authority. "Agamemnon will pay for his arrogance, but not by your hand. Not today. Sheath your sword, son of Peleus. Use words instead of bronze. The time for killing will come, but this is not that time." Achilles hesitated, balanced between rage and reason, between the satisfaction of immediate vengeance and the promise of greater satisfaction to come. Then, slowly, he released his sword, letting it slide back into its scabbard with a soft metallic whisper. When he spoke, his voice was ice and iron, controlled fury more frightening than any shout. "You coward," Achilles said, and the word carried across the assembly like a physical blow. "You dog-faced coward who steals from the men who fight your battles. You who sit in your tent while others bleed, who take credit for victories won by better men, who dare to threaten me with the loss of what I have rightfully earned." Agamemnon's face went purple with rage, but Achilles continued before he could respond. "Take Briseis. Take her. I will not stop you. But know this, son of Atreus. From this moment forward, Achilles fights no more in your war. My Myrmidons and I will remain in our camp. We will not take the field. We will not defend your ships when the Trojans attack. We will sit and watch while your army is destroyed. And when you come crawling to beg for our help, I will laugh in your face." He turned to the assembly, to the warriors who had watched this confrontation in stunned silence. "You are all witnesses. Remember this day. Remember who insulted whom. Remember who chose pride over the lives of his men. When the Trojans are burning your ships and killing your friends, remember that it did not have to be this way. Agamemnon chose this. Agamemnon will pay for it." Without waiting for a response, Achilles strode from the assembly, his Myrmidons falling in behind him like a personal army, their loyalty to their captain absolute, their contempt for the supreme commander barely hidden. Agamemnon stood alone in the center of the gathering, humiliated, defied, his authority challenged in a way that could not be undone. He could pursue the quarrel, could try to force Achilles to fight, but what would be the point? Achilles had the finest warriors in the army. Any attempt to compel him would result in civil war. So Agamemnon did the only thing he could do. He returned Chryseis to her father, ending the plague, restoring Apollo's favor. And then, to salvage what remained of his pride, he sent heralds to Achilles' camp to collect Briseis. The heralds found Achilles sitting by the shore, staring out at the sea, his lyre in his hands. He did not resist when they asked for the woman. He did not rage or threaten. He simply let them take her, watching with cold eyes as Briseis was led away to Agamemnon's tent. But that night, alone by the dark water, Achilles wept, and then he prayed. His mother Thetis rose from the waves like a silver dream, her divine beauty undimmed by her son's mortal tears. Achilles told her everything: the insult, the withdrawal, the burning need for Agamemnon to understand what he had lost by disrespecting the best of the Achaeans. "Go to Zeus," Achilles begged. "Ask him to favor the Trojans. Let them push the Greeks back to their ships. Let Agamemnon see his army dying without me. Let him understand what it means to fight a war without Achilles." Thetis listened, her heart breaking for her son, even as it swelled with the fierce pride that mothers feel when their children demand justice. She rose to Olympus that very night and knelt before Zeus's throne, reminding him of favors she had done for the king of gods, calling in debts that stretched back to the beginning of time. Zeus agreed. Reluctantly, knowing the suffering his decision would cause. He agreed. The next morning, when the Greeks marched forth to battle, they marched without Achilles. And the Trojans, sensing something had changed, attacked with a fury they had not shown in years. The tide of war was turning. The Greeks were about to learn what it meant to fight without their greatest champion. And in his tent by the shore, Achilles listened to the sounds of battle growing closer and smiled. The ships were burning. Hector had driven the Greeks back across the plain, back through their defensive trenches, back to the very edge of the sea where their 1,000 vessels lay beached and vulnerable. Torches arced through the air, trailing smoke and flame, landing on decks that had been dried by 9 years of Mediterranean sun. The wood caught eagerly, hungrily, fire spreading from ship to ship while Greek warriors fought desperately to save their only means of escape. Patroclus watched from the Myrmidon camp, his heart breaking with every scream that carried across the distance. He had been Achilles' companion since childhood, bound to the greatest warrior of the age by ties stronger than blood. Some said they were cousins. Some said they were lovers. Some said their relationship defied any single category, encompassing friendship and brotherhood and something deeper that had no name. What mattered was this: Patroclus could not bear to watch the army die while he and Achilles sat idle. He found Achilles in his tent, the hero's face unreadable as the sounds of catastrophe filtered through the canvas walls. Outside, the sky glowed orange with reflected flames. The air smelled of smoke and blood and the particular acrid stench of burning pitch. "They are dying," Patroclus said, and his voice cracked with emotion he could not contain. "Our friends, our allies, men we have fought beside for 9 years. They are dying, Achilles, and we do nothing. Agamemnon chose this," Achilles replied, his voice flat, empty of the rage that had burned so hot just days before. "Let him see what his pride has cost him." "And what of your pride?" Patroclus demanded. "What of the honor you claim to value so highly? Is it honorable to let men die for a quarrel they had no part in? Is it glorious to sit in comfort while the army that trusted you is destroyed?" Achilles looked at his companion, at the face that had been dear to him since before either of them understood what war would ask of them. He saw the anguish there, the desperate need to act, and something shifted in his heart. "I will not fight," Achilles said. "I will not give Agamemnon the satisfaction. But you—" He paused, considering, weighing options. "You could go in my place, wear my armor, led my Myrmidons. The Trojans will think I have returned to battle. They will flee before you, and perhaps that will be enough to save the ships." Hope flared in Patroclus's eyes, bright and dangerous. "You would allow this?" "I would command it. But hear me, Patroclus, and remember what I say. Drive the Trojans back from the ships. Save the fleet, but go no further. Do not pursue them to the walls of Troy. Do not let success make you reckless. Without me beside you, without my mother's blessing, you are mortal, vulnerable. If you push too far, if you challenge Hector or any of their greatest champions, you will die." Patroclus heard the words. He even understood them. But in that moment, with the ships burning and the army screaming and the chance for glory finally within reach, he did not truly listen. He donned Achilles' armor. The transformation was remarkable. The bronze that had been crafted for the son of a goddess fit Patroclus imperfectly, too large in some places and too tight in others. But from a distance, in the chaos of battle, no one would notice. The famous plumed helmet, the shield that had seen 1,000 combats, the greaves and breastplate that the Trojans had learned to fear, all of it now clothed a man who was brave and capable but utterly, fatally, mortal. The Myrmidons mustered with eager fury. They had been restrained too long, held back from the fighting by their captain's quarrel, watching opportunities for glory pass them by. Now, finally, they would be unleashed. They formed their ranks with the discipline that made them the finest fighting force in the Greek army. Their spears aligned, their shields overlapping, their eyes fixed on the smoke rising from the ships. Patroclus led them forth like a thunderbolt released from a hand that had held it too long. The Trojans saw Achilles' armor approaching and felt their courage waver. They saw the Myrmidons advancing in their terrible formation, and remembered every defeat they had suffered at these warriors' hands. The fire that had seemed so close to victory suddenly felt premature. A celebration begun before the game was truly won. Hector tried to rally them, shouting commands that were lost in the growing chaos. But the momentum had shifted. The Greeks, seeing what they thought was Achilles' return to battle, found new strength in their exhausted limbs. They pushed back against the Trojan advance, fighting with the desperate energy of men who had glimpsed salvation. Patroclus was magnificent. He moved through the battle like a man possessed, his spear finding Trojan after Trojan, his presence turning every engagement in the Greeks' favor. The ships were saved. The flames were extinguished. The Trojan advance collapsed into retreat, and still Patroclus pressed forward, drunk on success, deaf to the echo of Achilles' warning. He pursued the fleeing Trojans across the plain. He pursued them to the walls of Troy itself, climbing the very stones that no Greek had touched in 9 years of siege. 3 times he attempted to scale the battlements. 3 times Apollo himself pushed him back, the gods' invisible hands sending him tumbling down to the earth below. The 3rd time, Apollo spoke, his voice carrying the weight of divine command. "Go back, Patroclus. This city is not fated to fall to you, nor even to Achilles. Go back and live." But Patroclus could not stop. The blood was singing in his veins. The glory he had always watched from a distance was finally his to claim. He turned from the walls, seeking other opponents, lesser gods to defy. He found Hector instead. The Trojan prince had watched this false Achilles rampage across the battlefield, had seen his countrymen die by the dozens beneath that familiar spear. Anger built in him, hot and righteous, the fury of a man defending his home against an invader who seemed impossible to stop. They met in the shadow of Troy's walls, 2 champions facing each other while armies swirled around them. But Patroclus was tired now, exhausted by hours of fighting, weakened by the efforts that had saved the ships and driven the Trojans back. And Apollo, who had warned him once already, intervened again. The god's hand struck Patroclus between the shoulder blades, a blow no mortal could see but every mortal would feel. The helmet flew from his head. The spear dropped from his suddenly nerveless fingers. He stood swaying, dazed, defenseless. Euphorbus struck first, a Trojan warrior seizing the opportunity to wound a seemingly invincible enemy. His spear pierced Patroclus's back, a painful blow but not a killing one, and then Hector drove his spear through Patroclus's belly. The borrowed armor could not save him. Nothing could save him now. Patroclus fell to his knees in the Trojan dust, looking up at the prince who had killed him, knowing that he had ignored every warning, had pushed too far, had reached for glory that was never meant to be his. "You think you have won something," Patroclus whispered, blood bubbling on his lips. "But Hector, hear me now. Your death is coming. Achilles will find you. Achilles will kill you. And when you stand before him, Remember that I told you so." He died with those words hanging in the air, a prophecy as certain as any Calchas had ever spoken. Hector stripped the armor from the body, claiming the famous bronze as his own prize. But as he fastened the straps, as he settled the weight of Achilles' war gear upon his shoulders, he felt something cold touch his heart. The armor fit him perfectly, as if it had been made for him, as if it had been waiting for him all along. It was the fit of a shroud. It was the embrace of the death that Patroclus had promised. The sun set over the battlefield, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. Somewhere in the Greek camp, Achilles did not yet know that his dearest companion was dead, that the armor he had lent in mercy had become a trophy for his greatest enemy, that his withdrawal from the war had cost him everything he truly valued. But he would learn soon, and when he did, the war would change forever. The sound that emerged from Achilles' throat was not human. It was the cry of an animal discovering a wound too deep to survive, the howl of a soul being torn in half. He fell to his knees in the sand, clutching his head, his fingers digging furrows in his scalp as if he could claw out the knowledge that had been delivered to him. Patroclus was dead. Patroclus, who had been the gentle heart that balanced Achilles' fury. Patroclus, who had been the only person in the world who saw him as something other than a weapon to be wielded, or a legend to be worshipped. Patroclus, who had worn his armor into battle and died because Achilles had been too proud to fight, too stubborn to swallow his anger and save the man who mattered more than any quarrel with Agamemnon. The other Greeks kept their distance, watching with the helpless expressions of men who did not know how to comfort grief so vast. Some had lost brothers, sons, fathers in this war. They thought they understood loss. But this was something different. This was watching a god discover mortality, watching invincibility crack and crumble. Achilles lay in the sand for hours, weeping without shame, his great body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his chest. The sun moved across the sky, indifferent to human suffering. The sounds of the camp continued around him, soldiers tending wounds, blacksmiths repairing equipment, the endless small activities that kept an army functioning. All of it meaningless now, all of it empty. When the tears finally slowed, when Achilles raised his head and looked at the world with eyes that had been transformed by loss, something had changed in him. The rage that had kept him in his tent, the pride that had allowed men to die while he nursed his grievance, all of it had burned away, leaving only a cold, clear purpose. Hector would die. Nothing else mattered. Nothing else existed. The universe had narrowed to a single point, a single goal, a single name that Achilles would carve into history with blood and bronze. But there was a problem. Hector now wore Achilles' armor. The divine craftsmanship that had protected the son of Peleus through countless battles now protected the man who had killed his dearest friend. To face Hector, Achilles would need new protection, new weapons, new armor worthy of the vengeance he intended. Thetis came to him as the stars emerged, rising from the sea with the particular grace that marked her as something other than mortal. She held her son as she had when he was small, stroking his hair, murmuring words of comfort that could not truly comfort. She knew what he intended. She knew what it would cost. "If you kill Hector," Thetis whispered, "your own death follows soon after. The fates have decreed it. Avenge Patroclus, and you will never see your homeland again. You will never grow old. You will die here, on this foreign shore, far from everyone who loves you." Achilles looked at his mother with eyes that held no fear, only certainty. "Then I will die here," he said. I could not save him, mother. I sat in my tent, nursing my wounded pride, while he fought and fell. What kind of life would I have, going home, growing old, knowing that I failed the one person who truly knew me? Death after Hector is better than life with this guilt. Death with glory is better than years of shame. Thetis wept, but she did not argue. She had always known this moment would come. She had always known that her son would choose the short, bright life over the long, dim one. It was why she had tried to hide him on Skyros. It was why she had done everything in her power to keep him from this war. But mothers cannot protect their children forever. Not even divine mothers. Not even from the choices those children make for themselves. I will bring you armor, Thetis promised. Armor such as the world has never seen. Hephaestus owes me a debt from ancient times. He will forge weapons worthy of my son, worthy of the vengeance you seek. She rose to Olympus that very night, ascending to the workshop of the smith god, the divine craftsman whose skill exceeded anything mortal hands could achieve. Hephaestus remembered Thetis's kindness from ages past, when she had sheltered him after his fall from Olympus. He agreed to help without hesitation. The forge burned brighter than it had in centuries. The bellows wheezed and roared, feeding flames that could melt any metal, shape any material, transform raw or into objects of impossible beauty and deadly purpose. Hephaestus worked through the night, his hammer rising and falling in rhythms that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the universe itself. He made greaves first, leg armor that would protect Achilles from ankle to knee, fitted so precisely that they would feel like a second skin. He made a breastplate that curved to match the hero's torso, strong enough to turn any spear, light enough to allow full freedom of movement. He made a helmet crested with horsehair dyed in gold, a crown of war that would mark Achilles as something more than mortal. But the shield was his masterpiece. Hephaestus worked the bronze with hands that knew the secrets of creation itself. He layered the metal, fold upon fold, strength upon strength, until the disc was dense enough to stop any weapon ever forged. And then, on its surface, he began to create. He made the earth, the sea, and the sky. He set the sun in its course and the moon in its phases, surrounded by stars that seemed to actually twinkle against the bronze firmament. The constellations emerged beneath his tools. Orion the hunter, the bear that men call the wagon, the Pleiades clustering together like frightened sisters. The entire cosmos appeared on that circular surface, a universe in miniature. He made 2 cities. The first was at peace, its streets filled with the activities of prosperous life. A wedding procession wound through the marketplace, torches blazing, flutes and lyres playing, young women standing in doorways to watch the bride pass by. In the city's center, a dispute was being settled, 2 men arguing before judges who sat on polished stones. A crowd gathered to witness justice being done. The second city was at war. Armies surrounded its walls, their armor gleaming, their intentions clear. Inside, the defenders debated strategy, while women and children watched from the ramparts with terrified eyes. A scene of ambush emerged nearby. Soldiers hiding by a river, waiting for enemy livestock to approach. The moment before violence frozen in bronze. Around the cities, Hephaestus created the countryside. A field being plowed, the soil turning black and rich behind the blade. Workers receiving cups of wine at the end of each furrow. A royal estate at harvest time. Reapers swinging their sickles through golden wheat. Children gathering the fallen stalks. A feast being prepared beneath an oak tree. A vineyard heavy with grapes. Young men and women picking the fruit, carrying baskets on their heads. a boy in the center playing a lyre while others danced. The grapes themselves seemed to glow with purple ripeness against the bronze. A herd of cattle moving from pasture to stream, lions attacking the lead bull, herdsmen setting their dogs upon the predators. The chaos of the moment captured in metal that somehow conveyed motion and sound and even smell. A dancing floor like the one Daedalus had made for Ariadne in Crete. Young men and women holding hands, their feet seeming to move in the eternal pattern of the dance, spectators watching from the edges with expressions of joy, and around everything, at the very rim of the shield, the great river ocean, the water that surrounded all the earth, completing the cosmos that Hephaestus had created. When the sun rose, the armor was complete. Thetis descended from Olympus carrying weapons that gleamed with divine light. Armor that seemed to pulse with its own life. A shield that contained the entire world within its bronze circumference. Achilles donned the new armor and felt power flowing through him. Strength beyond anything he had known before. He lifted the shield, saw the universe reflected in its surface, understood that he carried with him now everything worth fighting for, everything worth dying for. He was ready. Tomorrow, Hector would learn what it meant to kill the man Achilles loved. The gates of Troy opened at dawn, and Hector walked out to meet his fate. He had known this moment would come since the day he stripped Achilles' armor from Patroclus's body. He had felt the shadow of it following him through the weeks since, growing darker, growing closer, growing impossible to ignore. His father had begged him to stay within the walls. His mother had wept and torn her hair and pleaded with him not to go. His wife Andromache had held their infant son up to him, showing him what he would leave behind, what he would orphan with his death. He had kissed them all. He had spoken the words that duty required. And then he had walked through the gates, because Hector was not a man who could hide behind walls while others fought in his place. Because Hector's honor would not allow him to survive by cowardice, even if cowardice might have saved him. The Greek army parted as Achilles approached, warriors stepping aside to create a corridor of open ground between the two champions. No one would interfere in this combat. No one would dare. This was between Achilles and Hector, between grief and glory, between the man who had everything to avenge and the man who had everything to lose. Achilles' new armor blazed in the morning light, the divine craftsmanship making him appear larger than human, more terrible than mortal. The shield that contained the cosmos caught the sun and threw it back multiplied, a disk of captured light that seemed to burn with its own fire. Behind the visor of his golden helmet, his eyes held nothing but death. Hector saw that face and felt something he had never felt before in his entire warrior's life. He felt fear, not the ordinary fear that all men feel before battle. The quickening pulse and tightening gut that sharpens senses and speeds reactions. This was something deeper. This was the cold, certain knowledge that he was facing something beyond his ability to defeat, that the next few minutes would be his last, that everything he loved and hoped for was about to end. He ran. The greatest warrior Troy had ever produced, the defender of his city. He turned from Achilles and ran like a frightened deer. Around the walls of Troy he fled, his armor clanking, his breath coming in desperate gasps, pursued by a man who ran like the wind itself, who seemed to float over the ground while Hector stumbled and strained. 3 times around the walls they ran, past the same gates, the same towers, the same watching faces. Priam and Hecuba called down from the ramparts, their voices cracking with despair. On the 4th circuit, Athena intervened. The goddess appeared to Hector in the guise of his brother Deiphobus, running beside him, matching his pace, speaking words of encouragement. "Brother, let us stand together. Let us face Achilles as two. He cannot defeat us both. Hector's heart swelled with gratitude and renewed courage. He stopped running. He turned to face his pursuer, believing his brother stood beside him, believing he was no longer alone. And in that moment, when he looked for Deiphobus, no one was there. The illusion vanished. Athena had tricked him, had used his love for his brother to bring him to the killing ground. Hector understood then that the gods themselves wanted him dead, that his fate had been sealed before he ever walked through the gates. So, he said, and his voice was steady now, the voice of a man who has accepted what cannot be changed. The gods have called me to my death, but let me not die without a struggle, without glory, without giving future generations something to sing about. He drew his sword and charged. Achilles met him with a spear thrust aimed at the throat. Hector knew his own armor, the armor that had once belonged to his enemy. He knew where the gaps were, where the bronze did not quite meet, where a blade could find flesh. He twisted aside, the spear point passing so close it drew a line of fire across his neck without breaking the skin. But Achilles knew that armor too, knew it better than Hector could possibly know it, knew every seam, every junction, every place where mortality waited behind the bronze. His second thrust found the gap at the base of Hector's throat, the small space where the helmet did not quite meet the breastplate. The spear point drove through flesh and muscle and windpipe, emerging from the back of Hector's neck in a spray of blood that caught the sunlight like scattered rubies. Hector fell. The impact with the ground drove the spear deeper, pinning him to the Trojan soil he had defended all his life. He tried to speak, tried to beg for the honor of proper burial. But only blood emerged from his ruined throat. His eyes found Achilles' face, saw no mercy there, saw only the cold satisfaction of vengeance achieved. "Dog," Achilles said, his voice carrying across the silent battlefield. "You thought you could kill those I loved and walk away. You thought you could wear my armor, pretend to be my equal, escape the consequence of what you did. But there is no escape. There is only this. And this is not enough. This will never be enough." He stripped the armor from Hector's body, reclaiming the bronze that had belonged to him, that had protected Patroclus in his final battle. The other Greeks gathered, driving their spears into Hector's corpse, each man claiming a share in the death of Troy's greatest champion. And then, Achilles did something that shocked even warriors hardened by 9 years of war. He cut slits in Hector's ankles, threaded leather straps through the wounds, and tied the body to the back of his chariot. He mounted, took the reins in hands still slick with Trojan blood, and began to drive. Around the walls of Troy he dragged Hector's body, through the dust and the rocks and the refuse that collected outside any city's walls. The beautiful face that had been Troy's pride scraped against the ground. The limbs that had wielded weapons with such skill flopped lifelessly behind the speeding chariot. Priam watched from the walls, his screams tearing his aged throat. Hecuba collapsed, her mind unable to process what her eyes were seeing. The people of Troy wailed and tore their hair and cursed the gods who had allowed this desecration. Achilles heard none of it. He drove on, around and around, dragging the ruin of his enemy through the dirt, trying to purge his grief through degradation, trying to fill the emptiness where Patroclus had been with the destruction of the man who had created that emptiness. But no matter how many times he circled the walls, no matter how thoroughly he violated the body of his fallen foe, the grief remained. Patroclus was still dead. The world was still broken. And somewhere in the depths of his rage, Achilles began to understand that vengeance could wound but never heal, could punish but never restore. He drove until his horses were exhausted, until the body behind him was barely recognizable as human. Then he returned to the Greek camp, leaving Hector's remains in the dust outside his tent, a trophy of his victory, a reminder of his pain. The gods watched from Olympus, and even they were troubled by what they saw. 12 days passed, and still Achilles would not release Hector's body. Each morning, he tied the corpse to his chariot and dragged it around Patroclus's burial mound, circling the tomb of his beloved companion with the ruin of his enemy. Each evening, he left the body in the dust, exposed to the elements, denied the funeral rites that every warrior deserved. But the gods would not allow such desecration to continue forever. Apollo preserved Hector's body from decay, keeping the flesh whole despite the abuse it suffered, protecting even in death the champion who had honored him in life. And Zeus, watching from his throne, decided that enough was enough. He sent Thetis to her son with a message: "Release the body, accept the ransom that will be offered. Let this grief exhaust itself in something other than endless degradation." He sent Iris to Troy with a different message: "Go to the Greek camp, go alone, by night, with ransom for your son. The gods will protect you." Priam heard the message and felt something kindle in his chest that he had thought was dead. Hope, perhaps, or simply the desperate need to do something, anything, rather than continue watching from the walls while his son's body was violated day after day. That night, the old king gathered treasures from his palace. He filled a wagon with gold and bronze, with magnificent robes and tripods, with everything precious that Troy possessed. He chose his finest mules to pull the wagon. And then, while his wife begged him not to go, while his remaining sons argued that the mission was suicidal, Priam climbed onto the wagon and drove out through the gates of Troy, alone, unarmed, an old man traveling through enemy territory in the dead of night, carrying a fortune that any passing soldier might kill him for. But the gods had promised protection, and the gods, when they chose to, kept their promises. Hermes appeared to guide him, disguised as a young Greek warrior, leading the wagon through the maze of tents and sleeping soldiers. The camp that should have been impenetrable remained oblivious to his passage. Guards looked away at exactly the right moments. Dogs that should have barked remained silent. The night itself seemed to bend around Priam, creating a tunnel of safety through hostile territory. He reached Achilles' tent without being challenged, and found the hero sitting alone, his meal untouched, his eyes fixed on something invisible in the middle distance. The great warrior who had killed so many looked somehow diminished in the lamplight, smaller than the legend, more human than the monster. Priam entered without announcement, crossed the space between them before Achilles could react, and fell to his knees. He took Achilles' hands, the hands that had killed his son, and pressed them to his lips. "Think of your own father," Priam whispered, his voice cracking with age and grief. "Peleus, far away in Phthia, growing old, perhaps already dead, waiting for a son who will never come home. He has hope, at least. He can imagine you returning, can dream of embracing you again. But I have watched my son die. I have watched his body dragged through the dust. I have no hope left. Only this, only the chance to take my boy home, to wash his wounds, to give him to the fire with the honor he deserves." Achilles looked at the old man kneeling before him and felt something shift in his chest. He saw his own father in Priam's face, saw the grief that would one day break Peleus when news of his death reached home. He saw himself in Hector, a warrior doing what duty demanded, beloved by his family, mourned by his people. He saw Patroclus too, in the love that drove Priam across a battlefield to recover his child. He understood, in that moment, that grief was grief, that loss was loss, that the enemy kneeling before him was as human as he was, had loved as deeply, had lost as completely. The rage that had sustained him for 12 days began to crack. The hate that had kept him circling those walls, dragging that body, punishing a corpse, it was not gone, not entirely. But it was no longer alone. Something else had entered alongside it. Something that felt almost like compassion. "Rise," Achilles said. And his voice was gentle in a way it had not been for weeks. "Do not kneel to me. We have both suffered enough." He helped the old man to a seat. He called for food and wine, for the hospitality that enemies could share when the fighting paused. They ate together in the lamplight. Two men bound by mutual loss, by the strange intimacy of those who have taken everything from each other. "Your son was brave," Achilles said finally. "He was the best of them. If circumstances had been different, if we had met somewhere else, in some other life, but we did not. We met here in this war and we did what warriors do. I do not apologize for killing him. He would not want me to. But I understand what you have lost, old king. I understand it better than you know." He gave orders for Hector's body to be prepared. Servants washed away the dust and blood, anointed the preserved flesh with oils, wrapped the Prince of Troy in fine linens that would serve as his shroud. They worked through the night while Achilles and Priam sat together, not speaking now, just sharing the silence of men who have come through something terrible and emerged, if not at peace, then at least at rest. At dawn, Priam departed with his son's body loaded carefully in the wagon that had brought ransom. Achilles granted him 11 days of truce, time enough to conduct the funeral rites that Trojan custom demanded. For 11 days there would be no fighting. For 11 days, both sides would mourn their dead. "Go in peace," Achilles said as the old king drove away. "Bury your son. Sing the songs that honor him. And know that I will think of you sometimes when I think of what this war has cost us all." Priam did not look back. He could not afford to. He drove toward Troy with the son he had watched die, the son he had watched desecrated, the son he would now finally lay to rest. Behind him, Achilles stood in the entrance of his tent, watching until the wagon disappeared into the morning mist. Somewhere in the distance, birds began to sing. Hector's funeral lasted 9 days. The Trojans gathered wood, built a pyre worthy of their greatest champion, laid his body upon it with all the honors due to a prince and defender. They lit the flames and watched them consume everything mortal about the man who had been their hope. They gathered his ashes in a golden urn, buried the urn in a barrow covered with stones, and feasted in his memory until the 11th day dawned. And then, because wars do not end for grief, because the Greeks still surrounded their walls, and the quarrel that had started everything remained unresolved, the Trojans prepared to continue fighting. But something had changed. The death of Hector had broken something in Troy that could not be repaired. And the meeting between Achilles and Priam had begun something in the Greek camp that no one yet understood. The war was entering its final phase. The end was coming for all of them, Greek and Trojan alike. Only the gods knew how close that end truly was. Achilles knew he was living on borrowed time. Every dawn that broke over the Greek camp was a gift he had not expected to receive, a postponement of the fate his mother had foretold. Since the death of Hector, since the strange peace he had found in releasing the body to Priam, he had fought with a recklessness that alarmed even the most battle-hardened warriors. He sought out the most dangerous engagements, challenged the strongest opponents, threw himself into combat as if daring death to claim him. But death, it seemed, was taking its time. The weeks after Hector's funeral brought a steady stream of Trojan allies to bolster the city's defenses. Penthesilea arrived with her Amazons, fierce warrior women whose skill with bow and spear rivaled any Greek champion. Achilles killed her in single combat, and as she fell, their eyes met, and he saw something in her dying gaze that haunted him afterward. Beauty and courage extinguished together, another life ended by his hand, another thread cut from the tapestry of existence. Memnon came next, king of Ethiopia, leading an army from the edges of the known world. He was the son of Eos, the dawn goddess, and his armor gleamed with the light of sunrise itself. He and Achilles fought while both armies watched, two champions of divine blood testing each other's limits. Achilles won, as Achilles always won, but the victory felt hollow. Each triumph brought him closer to his own end. Each enemy he defeated was simply clearing the path to his grave. The morning of his death began like any other. The sun rose over the Aegean, painting the waves in shades of gold and rose. The Greek camp stirred with the sounds of men preparing for battle, the clang of bronze being donned, the whinny of horses being harnessed, the low murmur of prayers offered to gods who might or might not be listening. Achilles armed himself with the divine equipment Hephaestus had forged. The greaves clasped around his legs. The breastplate settled over his chest. The helmet with its golden crest crowned his head. He lifted the shield that contained the universe, felt its familiar weight on his arm, and walked out to meet whatever the day would bring. The fighting was fierce that morning, fiercer than it had been in weeks. The Trojans, perhaps sensing that something momentous was approaching, threw themselves against the Greek lines with desperate energy. Achilles moved through the chaos like a force of nature, his spear finding targets with mechanical precision, his presence turning every engagement in the Greeks' favor. He found himself near the Scaean Gate, the great entrance to Troy through which Hector had walked to his death. The fighting here was particularly intense, Trojans defending the approach to their city with the fury of men protecting their families. Achilles pressed forward, driving them back step by step, his mind focused entirely on the immediate combat, on the next spear thrust, the next shield block, the next enemy to fall before him. He did not see Paris until it was too late. The Prince of Troy stood on the walls above the gate, a bow in his hands that seemed too simple, too ordinary, for what it was about to accomplish. Paris was no great warrior. He had never faced Achilles in combat, had always hung back from the fiercest fighting, had earned the contempt of Greeks and Trojans alike for his preference for distance weapons over the honest clash of bronze on bronze. But Apollo stood beside him, invisible to mortal eyes, guiding his hand with divine precision. Paris drew the bowstring back. The arrow was ordinary, a shaft of ash wood with a bronze point, no different from thousands of others that had been loosed in this war. But Apollo's hand was on Paris's hand. Apollo's eye was sighting down the arrow's length, and Apollo knew exactly where to aim. The heel, the one spot on Achilles's body that the waters of Styx had not touched. The small patch of mortality that Thetis had created when she held her infant son by that single point, dipping him into the river of death, not realizing that she was leaving him one fatal vulnerability. The arrow flew. It crossed the distance between the wall and the gate in less than a heartbeat, a streak of wood and bronze that seemed to catch the sunlight as it descended. It passed through the chaos of battle without touching any of the hundreds of bodies that filled the space. It found its target with the precision that only a god could provide. Achilles felt the impact before he understood what had happened. a sudden fire in his heel, a pain unlike anything he had experienced in all his years of combat. He looked down and saw the arrow protruding from his ankle, saw blood beginning to flow, and understood with terrible clarity that this wound was different from all the others. This wound would not heal. He fell to his knees in the dust outside the Scian gate, the same dust where he had dragged Hector's body, the same ground that had drunk the blood of countless warriors over 10 years of war. His strength was flowing out of him along with his blood. The divine vitality that had made him invincible draining away through that small wound in his heel. The Greeks surged forward to protect him, forming a wall of shields around their fallen champion. The Trojans pressed their advantage, sensing that something momentous had occurred, that the seemingly immortal Achilles had finally been brought low. The fighting intensified, men dying by the dozens in the struggle over a single wounded body. Achilles felt the world growing dim around the edges. He thought of his father, who would receive news of this death in distant Phthia, who would weep for a son he had known would never return. He thought of his mother, who had tried so hard to protect him, who had known from the beginning that this day would come. He thought of Patroclus, waiting for him in the underworld, patient as always, ready to welcome him home. He thought of the choice he had made on Skyros, the decision to pursue glory instead of length of days. He had known the price. He had accepted it willingly. And now, as his vision darkened and his breathing slowed, he found that he did not regret it. The short, bright life, that was what he had chosen. And by the gods, it had been bright. Achilles, son of Peleus, son of Thetis, the greatest warrior the world would ever know, died in the dust outside Troy's walls with the sun warm on his face, and the sounds of battle fading into a silence that had been waiting for him all along. The Greeks recovered his body and bore it back to camp with the reverence due to a fallen god. His armor, the divine craftsmanship of Hephaestus, was claimed by Odysseus after a contest that drove Ajax to madness and suicide. His ashes were mingled with those of Patroclus, the two companions united in death as they had been in life. And on the walls of Troy, Paris lowered his bow and wondered why victory felt so much like loss. The war continued, but the heart had gone out of it. With Achilles dead and Hector buried, both sides seemed to be fighting for memory rather than conviction, going through the motions of a conflict that had lost its central characters. The Greeks attacked. The Trojans defended. Men died. Nothing changed. It was Odysseus who finally found another way. The king of Ithaca had been thinking about the problem of Troy's walls since the beginning of the siege. 10 years of direct assault had proven their impregnability. 10 years of blockade had failed to starve the city into submission. Every conventional approach to conquest had been tried, and had failed. If Troy was to fall, it would have to be through means that no one had ever attempted before. The idea came to him in pieces, fragments of inspiration that gradually assembled themselves into a coherent plan. Troy's walls could not be breached from outside. But what if the Greeks could get inside? What if they could bypass the walls entirely, appear within the city as if by magic, open the gates for their waiting army? They would need a disguise, something the Trojans would accept, would welcome, would bring within their walls themselves, something large enough to conceal a meaningful force of warriors, something that seemed innocent, even sacred, impossible to suspect, a gift, an offering, a monument to the war's end, seemingly left behind by a defeated enemy. A horse. Hippias was the craftsman chosen to build it. He was known more for his boxing than his woodworking, but he possessed skills that others lacked, an ability to shape timber into forms that seemed almost alive. He worked in secret, in a cove hidden from Trojan observers, assembling the frame from pine and fir cut in the mountains behind the Greek camp. The horse took shape over weeks of careful construction. Its body was hollow, large enough to hold 50 men if they packed themselves tightly, breathing shallowly, making no sound. Its legs were sturdy enough to support that hidden weight. Its head was carved with an artistry that gave it an almost living presence. Eyes that seemed to gleam with intelligence, nostrils that seemed to flare with breath. A trapdoor was built into its belly, invisible from outside, accessible only to those who knew where to look. Handholds were carved into the interior walls, giving the hidden warriors something to grip during the long hours they would need to wait. The whole structure was mounted on wheels, allowing it to be moved by a team of men pulling ropes. When it was finished, the horse stood as tall as a 2-story building, a monument of wood and ambition that dominated the beach where it had been built. The Greeks gathered around it in the gray light of dawn, looking up at the creation that represented their last hope. Odysseus selected the warriors who would hide inside. He chose men known for their courage and their discipline, fighters who could remain silent and still for hours, who would not panic in the darkness, who would emerge ready for combat despite the cramped conditions. Menelaus insisted on being among them, his desire to reclaim Helen overriding any concern for his safety. Neoptolemus, Achilles' young son, demanded his place, eager to avenge his father's death. Odysseus himself would lead them. This was his plan. Its success or failure would rest on his shoulders. The rest of the Greek army boarded their ships and sailed away, around the headland to the island of Tenedos, where they would wait in concealment for the signal that would bring them back. The beach that had held 1,000 ships for 10 years was suddenly empty. The fires that had burned for a decade suddenly cold. The horse stood alone on the sand, an offering to Athena according to the inscription carved on its base, a monument to the war's end, a gift from the departing enemy. The Trojans woke to a silence they had not heard in 10 years. The sounds of the Greek camp, the hammering and shouting and constant activity that had formed the background of their lives for a decade, were gone. They climbed their walls and saw the empty beach, the abandoned fortifications, the single strange structure standing where an army had been. Debate raged within the city. Priam summoned his advisors, his generals, his priests, anyone who might help him understand what this apparition meant. Some argued for destroying the horse immediately, burning it where it stood, eliminating any possibility of deception. Others insisted it was a sacred offering, that destroying it would bring Athena's wrath upon the city. Cassandra screamed her warnings, as she always screamed, as she had screamed for 10 years while no one listened. She saw the warriors hidden in the horse's belly. She saw the flames that would soon consume her city. She saw everything that was about to happen, and she could not make anyone believe her. Laocoon, a priest of Poseidon, threw a spear at the horse's flank, declaring that he feared Greeks even when they bore gifts. The spear struck the wood and quivered there, and from within the hollow body, the hidden warriors held their breath, certain they had been discovered. But before the Trojans could investigate further, the sea erupted. 2 enormous serpents emerged from the waves, their scales gleaming, their eyes burning with divine purpose. They made straight for Laocoon and his 2 young sons who stood beside him. They wrapped their coils around the 3 bodies, and squeezed until bones cracked and breath stopped and 3 lives ended in screaming agony. The Trojans saw and understood. The gods themselves had punished Laocoon for his attack on the sacred offering. The horse must be genuine. The horse must be brought inside. They tore down a section of their own walls to accommodate its height. They pulled it through the gap on ropes, singing hymns of victory, celebrating the end of the war that had defined their lives for a decade. They positioned it in the center of the city, near the great temple of Athena, and they feasted and danced and drank until exhaustion finally sent them to their beds. Inside the horse, in the darkness that smelled of pine resin and nervous sweat, Odysseus listened to the sounds of celebration fade into silence. Then, he opened the trapdoor. The city burned. It began with the opening of the gates, the great portals that had held against Greek assault for 10 years, swinging wide to admit the army that had sailed back under cover of darkness. It began with screams in the night, the clash of bronze, the particular sound a body makes when it falls to the ground with a spear through its chest. But it became something more than a battle. It became an ending. The Greeks poured through the streets of Troy like water through a broken dam, unstoppable, inevitable, filling every space with violence. They had waited 10 years for this moment. They had lost friends and brothers and sons on the plain outside these walls. They had endured homesickness and disease and the endless grinding frustration of a siege that seemed it would never end. Now, they took their payment in blood. The Trojans fought back with the desperate courage of men defending their families. Fathers stood in doorways with kitchen knives and farming tools, trying to buy time for wives and children to flee. Old men who had not held weapons in decades found swords and shields and stumbled into the chaos, knowing they would die but unwilling to die hiding. It made no difference. The Greeks had surprise and numbers and the accumulated rage of a decade. They moved through the city systematically, street by street, house by house, killing everything that resisted and much that did not. Priam died at the altar of Zeus, where he had gone seeking sanctuary, believing that even Greeks would respect the sacred space. Neoptolemus found him there, the old king clutching a sword he could barely lift, trying to protect his wife Hecuba and the women who had gathered with her. The young warrior, still angry over his father's death, showed no mercy. The temples burned. The palaces burned. The houses of common people burned alongside the mansions of the wealthy, fire making no distinction between classes. The smoke rose in columns so thick they blocked the stars, so high they could be seen from ships at sea, a beacon announcing to the world that Troy was dying. Helen was found in the palace, waiting in a chamber she had occupied for 10 years, her famous beauty unmarked by the chaos outside. Menelaus came for her with sword drawn, intending to kill the woman whose face had launched this war, whose choice had caused so much death. But when he saw her, when their eyes met across that burning room, he found that he could not strike. Whether it was love remembered or beauty overwhelming or simply exhaustion with killing, the sword lowered. He took her hand and led her from the flames. Andromache watched from a tower as her infant son Astyanax was thrown from the walls. The Greeks had decided that no male of Hector's line could be allowed to survive, to grow, to one day seek vengeance for what had been done tonight. The child fell without understanding what was happening, without knowing that his death was meant to ensure the permanence of Troy's destruction. His mother's screams echoed through the burning city, joining the chorus of grief that filled the smoke-thick air. By dawn, it was over. Troy was no longer a city. It was a graveyard of smoking ruins, of collapsed walls and shattered temples, of bodies lying in streets that had known laughter and commerce and the ordinary business of living. The great towers that had defied Greek arms for a decade were rubble. The massive walls that Poseidon and Apollo had built in ancient times were torn gaps leading to nothing. The survivors were gathered on the beach, women and children mostly, their men dead in the night's fighting. They would be distributed as slaves among the Greek victors. The queens and princesses of Troy reduced to serving the wives of the men who had destroyed their world. Hecuba, who had been queen of the greatest city in Asia, would end her days as property. The Greeks loaded their ships with plunder, with gold and bronze and precious objects that had accumulated in Troy over centuries of prosperity. They loaded their ships with human cargo too, the captive women who represented both their victory and its cost. They prepared to sail home to kingdoms they had not seen in 10 years, to families who might not recognize them, to lives that would never feel quite real after everything they had experienced. Odysseus stood on the beach as the sun rose over the ruins of Troy, his clever mind already turning to the journey ahead. He did not know that it would take him 10 more years to reach Ithaca, that the gods would punish him for his role in Troy's destruction, that he would lose every man who sailed with him before finally reaching home. Menelaus stood with Helen beside him, the woman who had caused all this, the prize he had spent a decade winning back. He did not know that their voyage home would be cursed with storms and shipwrecks, that years would pass before they saw Sparta again, that their marriage would never recover what it had lost. Agamemnon stood tallest among the kings, the supreme commander who had led this expedition to its ultimate success. He did not know that his wife Clytemnestra was waiting for him in Mycenae, that she had spent 10 years nursing her hatred over Iphigenia's death, that a bath was being prepared in which she would murder him the night of his return. The ship sailed. The smoke continued to rise from Troy's ruins, a pillar of gray against the morning blue that could be seen for miles in every direction. The sea birds returned to the harbor, confused by the silence, the absence of the human activity they had grown accustomed to over generations. The Trojan War was over, but its echoes would resound through history forever. Years passed, then decades, then centuries. The ruins of Troy settled into the landscape, stones sinking into soil, walls crumbling under the patient assault of weather and time. Grass grew over the scars of burning. Trees took root in what had been courtyards and throne rooms. The birds nested in the hollow places where once priests had prayed and children had played and kings had dreamed of glory. The survivors scattered across the Mediterranean, carrying their stories with them. Aeneas, a Trojan prince who had escaped the burning city, sailed west with a band of refugees, eventually reaching the shores of Italy where his descendants would found a city called Rome. The blood of Troy would flow through emperors and conquerors, through civilizations that would rise and fall long after the Greeks themselves had become a memory. The heroes of the Greek side met varied fates. Odysseus wandered for 10 years before reaching Ithaca, his journey becoming a story as famous as the war itself. Menelaus and Helen eventually returned to Sparta, where they lived out their days in a peace that felt like a faded echo of what they had once felt for each other. Ajax was dead by his own hand, driven mad by the dishonor of losing Achilles' armor to Odysseus. Diomedes returned home to find his wife had taken a lover, and he spent the rest of his life in exile. Agamemnon's death became its own cycle of tragedy, his murder by Clytemnestra avenged by their children Orestes and Electra in a chain of bloodshed that required divine intervention to finally end. The gods who had taken such interest in the war moved on to other amusements, other mortals to favor and destroy. Zeus continued ruling from his throne on Olympus. Athena continued spinning strategies and weaving tapestries of fate. Aphrodite continued making promises about love that always, somehow, ended in tears. The poets remembered. They gathered the stories, shaped them, polished them, passed them down through generations of singers who never saw Troy's walls, but could describe them in detail that made listeners weep. Homer, whoever he was, whenever he lived, collected these scattered songs into the Iliad and the Odyssey, giving permanent form to memories that might otherwise have faded. And so, the war lived on, not in bronze and blood, but in words. The heroes who died in the dust outside Troy's walls achieved the immortality they had sought, not through divine intervention, but through the simple power of stories well told. Achilles chose the short, bright life, and 3,000 years later we still speak his name. Hector defended his city to the death, and we still honor his courage. Priam begged for his son's body, and we still feel his grief. The ruins of Troy still exist, at a place called Hisarlik in modern Turkey. Archaeologists have excavated the layers of cities built on that site, one on top of another, each one rising from the ashes of its predecessor. They have found evidence of a great fire during the period when the legendary war might have occurred, burned walls and scattered artifacts that suggest some catastrophe befell this place around 1180 BC. Was there really a Helen? Did Achilles actually fight Hector outside those walls? Did a wooden horse truly end a 10-year siege? We cannot know for certain. The line between history and mythology blurs when you go back that far. What we know is that people believed these stories, told them to their children, shaped their understanding of heroism and tragedy around the events that supposedly took place on that windy plain. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the truth of Troy lies not in archaeological evidence or historical records, but in the simple fact that human beings have been moved by this story for 3 millennia. We still recognize ourselves in Achilles' rage and Priam's grief, in Helen's impossible position and Hector's doomed nobility. We still understand what it means to fight for something you believe in, to lose what you love most, to face fate with courage even when fate cannot be changed. The wind still blows across the Trojan plain. The Scamander still flows to the sea. The ruins still stand, barely visible beneath the grass and the centuries. And somewhere, in libraries and theaters and the quiet spaces where people read alone at night, the story continues to be told. The heroes rise again with each telling, fight their battles again, die their deaths again, achieve their immortality again. This is what remains of Troy, not stones, but stories, not walls, but words, not a city, but a song that will never end.